Snow had been falling since before dawn, the kind of soft, steady snowfall that made the whole town look like a Christmas card. I remember thinking, as I left the grocery store with 2 paper bags in my arms, that the holiday might actually feel normal this year. Quiet, peaceful, predictable. I had taken a week off from work and planned to spend Christmas alone in the old family cabin up near Ironwood, Michigan, my first Christmas since my mom passed. I wasn't ready to be around people, not even my siblings who'd scattered across the country. I just wanted silence, and the woods in winter were good at giving that. The drive out was slow but beautiful, the trees bending under the weight of the snow, the sky a pale, glassy gray. When I reached the turnoff to Ridgeline Road, I had to put the truck in four-wheel drive to push through the drifts building up along the path. The cabin stood dark and familiar at the end of the property, smoke-black chimney, wooden porch half buried. I parked, unloaded everything, and got a fire going. By the time dusk arrived, I had settled into a kind of fragile peace. It didn't last long. I first noticed something strange when I stepped outside to bring in extra firewood. Fresh snow had already covered most of my earlier tracks, but there, clear as day, were 2 sets of footprints that hadn't been there before. They came out of the tree line, walked right up to the edge of the porch, then stopped. No return prints leading away. I stood there, breath fogging in the cold air, telling myself it had to be a hunter or a hiker who'd turned back before stepping onto the porch. Maybe their returning tracks were filled in by the snow already, but the impressions were deep, crisp, new, and the way they stopped, 10 inches from the porch step, made something deep inside me tighten. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to put it out of my mind. Night came fast. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. I cooked dinner, poured a drink, and settled into an armchair near the fire. The warmth helped, but every now and then I felt a flicker of unease crawl up my spine. The cabin had always been safe. My parents brought us here every summer, and in the winter when roads were clear, but that night it felt different, hollow somehow. Around 9, while I was reading an old book I'd found on the shelf, I heard it. A single sharp knock. Not on the door, on the window. I froze. The book slipped from my hands. A log in the fireplace cracked loudly, the sound snapping through the room. I waited, heart thudding, listening so hard my ears rang. Another knock, this one lighter, like someone dragging a fingernail across the glass. I stood up slowly, feeling the old wooden floor creak beneath me. The window beside the dining table was covered with frost, but I could see the shape of something tall standing just outside. The silhouette didn't move, didn't shift its weight, it just stayed there. A black cutout against the white snow. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. Then the shape lifted an arm. I stumbled back so fast I nearly tripped over the table. My hand went to the counter, searching blindly until I found the flashlight I'd taken from the truck earlier. When I pointed it at the window, the beam lit up nothing but swirling snow. No figure, no tracks, nothing. My heart hammered so violently I felt nauseous. The cabin wasn't supposed to feel haunted, not by ghosts, but by memory. I wondered if maybe grief was messing with my mind, making me see things. It had happened before, the brain playing tricks. I locked both windows, drew the curtains, and tried to shake it off, though my hands trembled long afterward. By midnight, I was exhausted. I climbed into the loft bed, listening to the wind whistle through the pines. I must have dozed off because I didn't hear the first sound, only the second. A soft thump, then another, like something landing on the roof. The cabin roof wasn't high. If someone wanted to climb onto it, they could. A hunter, a trespasser, a drunk local. There were explanations, but none made me feel better. The thumps moved, slow, deliberate steps that traveled from one end of the roof to the other. Then they stopped above my bed. I stared up at the wooden planks overhead, every muscle tight. A low scraping noise followed. Metal on wood. I wanted to call someone, but there was no cell service out here. I grabbed my boots, my jacket, and sat upright, trying to decide whether staying inside or running out into the freezing woods was the bigger risk. Before I could decide, something hit the roof hard enough to send dust drifting down from the beams. Then, silence. It remained silent for so long I wondered if I'd imagined everything. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion because I woke to gray morning light filtering through the window curtains and a sound I recognized all too well. Crunching footsteps in the snow. I crawled to the window and lifted the curtain an inch. 3 people, at least I thought they were people, were standing just at the tree line. Their clothes were ragged, old-fashioned somehow. Their faces, I couldn't see their faces. Each wore something over their head, a burlap sack or cloth hood tied at the neck. They stood perfectly still, just watching the cabin. I dropped the curtain, heart roaring in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have weapons beyond a kitchen knife. I didn't have a phone signal. I didn't have neighbors for miles. And worst of all, they knew I was here. I stayed inside for hours, peering out through cracks, waiting to see if they would move. But they didn't. Not until late afternoon, when I blinked during a long stare out the window, and they were suddenly gone. That was almost worse. At dusk, I heard the sound of something brushing against the siding of the cabin. Slow, scraping movements. I didn't look. I didn't want to know. By full dark, I realized I couldn't stay here another night. I packed a backpack with the essentials, grabbed my keys, and prepared to sprint to the truck. But when I stepped outside, the cold biting instantly through my clothes, I saw something that made my blood drain away. Footprints. Dozens of them. Circling the cabin, as if they had spent the entire day walking around it again and again. My breath steamed out in a shaken gasp. Some prints were fresh, very fresh. The woods were silent, far too silent. I forced myself down the steps and toward the truck. Halfway there, something moved behind me. A soft crunch. I spun around. One of the hooded figures stood at the edge of the clearing, a tall, thin man, judging by the shape, wearing a stained, torn coat and a sack mask covering his head. Snow clung to his shoulders, and the fabric over his face bulged strangely, like something underneath was pushing outward. He tilted his head. I ran. I practically threw myself into the truck, fumbling with the keys, hands shaking uncontrollably. The headlights cut through the swirling snow, illuminating more figures emerging from the woods. 4, then 5, then more than I could count. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They just walked toward the truck in slow, measured steps. My tires spun at first, the snow too deep, the truck fishtailing before catching traction. I burst down the narrow road, praying it wouldn't drift shut before I reached the highway. In the rearview mirror, the figures stood at the road's entrance, watching me leave. They didn't chase. They just stared. When I finally reached town, civilization, lights, people, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat there for nearly 15 minutes, gripping the steering wheel because my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I told myself I'd go back in the morning with the sheriff, that I was just exhausted, grief-stricken, imagining things. But I knew I wouldn't, because when I looked at the truck after the sun came up, I saw long scratches down both sides, deep, curved, as if someone had dragged metal or bone along the panels. And wedged under the windshield wiper was something I hadn't noticed during the frantic drive, a piece of burlap fabric stiff with frost, and a message burned into it in dark, jagged letters, "We saw you sleep." I moved out of Michigan by spring. Sold the cabin cheap, never went back. Some nights, especially around Christmas, I think about the figures in the snow, how they moved, how they watched, how they knew I was alone. The new owner emailed me once, only once, asking if I'd ever had strange visitors in winter. I deleted the message without replying. Some things you don't want to say out loud, some things you don't want to remember, because remembering makes them real again. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Haverhill, Massachusetts, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, and where the snow seemed to fall just a little heavier than anywhere else. The streets were quiet, except for the crunch of boots in fresh snow and the faint hum of holiday lights strung across every lamppost. Inside the Thompson household, Emily Thompson and her younger brother, Jake, were perched on the living room floor, tearing through wrapping paper with a childlike fervor that only came once a year. Their parents, Karen and David, were in the kitchen, preparing a feast that smelled of roasted turkey and cinnamon in the air. But outside, the wind had begun to pick up, whistling through the evergreens that lined the property. It wasn't unusual for Haverhill to get a late December storm, but this one had a strange bite to it, like the kind of cold that gnaws at your bones rather than just numbs them. Emily noticed it first. While reaching for a box of ornaments in the living room, she thought she saw a shadow flicker past the frosted window. At first, she chalked it up to her imagination, But when she turned her head, she realized the shadow wasn't just a trick of the light. It was someone or something standing in the yard. "Jake," she whispered, nudging her brother. "Do you see that?" Jake, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "It's probably just Dad putting up the lights again. Don't be paranoid." Emily frowned. "No, it's not him. Look, by the oak tree." Through the snow-smeared window, they could see a figure standing motionless, watching the house. Its features were obscured by a hooded coat, and yet Emily could feel eyes burning into her like icy coals. Her stomach twisted. She wanted to run to the kitchen, to her parents, to anyone who would make this feeling go away, but something rooted her to the spot. David came into the living room, wiping his hands on a towel. "What's going on?" "There's someone outside," Emily stammered. "By the oak tree, watching us." David peered out the window but saw nothing. "Emily, it's probably just a neighbor. It's snowing heavily. You're seeing things." Karen joined them, her expression tired but loving. "Let's not worry about shadows tonight. Dinner's almost ready." Reluctantly, Emily let it go, though unease still churned in her chest. That night, after the last of the presents were opened and the children had been sent off to bed, the storm outside grew louder. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and making the Christmas lights flicker. David double-checked the locks on every door and window, humming to himself, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. Karen stayed up a little longer, sipping cocoa by the fireplace, occasionally glancing toward the darkened living room. Then, around midnight, it happened. The sound was subtle at first, a soft, deliberate scraping at the back door. Karen froze, her mug halfway to her lips. The scraping came again, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was testing the lock. "David?" Karen's voice trembled slightly. David set down the dish towel and walked toward the door, his hand resting on the doorknob. "Probably just the wind," he muttered. Though his voice lacked conviction, the scraping became a soft thud, then another. Something heavy, dragging itself across the porch. David's hand went to the deadbolt. He slowly unlocked the door, wincing as the hinges creaked in protest. "Hello?" he called. No answer. Only the storm, only the snow that seemed to have swallowed the night whole. Karen stepped closer to him, gripping his arm. "David, maybe we should just wait until morning. We don't need to open it." He nodded, though the unease in his eyes mirrored hers. Yeah, maybe you're right." The next morning, Emily and Jake ran to the living room, eager to show their parents the new toys Santa had left. But as they rounded the corner, their smiles faltered. The back door, which David had locked so carefully, was wide open. Snow had blown into the house, leaving a thin, powdery trail across the wooden floor. And on the floor, etched into the snow, were footprints. Not regular footprints, but heavy, uneven ones, as though the person or thing had been dragging its feet. David's face turned pale. Karen grabbed the children and ushered them upstairs while he inspected the door. There were scratches along the frame, deep gouges, and the handle had been twisted almost off. They called the police, but by the time the officers arrived, the storm had melted most of the tracks outside. They questioned the Thompsons, asked about neighbors, about anyone who might have grudges. The officers left, promising to keep an eye out, but there was no resolution. No suspect. No explanation. The unease didn't end there. For the next few days, Emily began noticing small things. Ornaments moved from one spot to another, presents slightly shifted, the faint scent of something metallic in the air, like blood. Jake insisted she was imagining it, but Karen caught it too. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone, even in a house that was supposed to be safe. One night, Emily woke to the sound of faint singing, a low, garbled Christmas carol drifting from the living room. She crept down the stairs, heart hammering, and froze at the sight before her. There in front of the fireplace stood a figure. Cloaked, hooded, face obscured. Its hands were thin, elongated, and it moved with a slow, unnatural grace. The singing stopped the instant Emily gasped. The figure turned, tilting its head unnaturally, cropped as if studying her. Then it vanished. Emily ran back to her room, shaking. She didn't tell anyone, fearing they would dismiss her as a child, but the fear settled deep in her chest like a stone. That Christmas, things escalated. Lights flickered even when no bulbs were loose. Gifts were torn open overnight, replaced with strange objects, pieces of old metal, shards of glass, and once a small, crudely carved wooden doll with empty eyes. The family began sleeping in the same room, this terrified to be alone. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 week after the first sighting, the storm returned. This time, it was worse. Blinding, almost violent. The power went out, plunging the house into darkness. David lit a few candles, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the shadows seemed alive, crawling across the walls. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back door, followed by scraping, dragging sounds. The children screamed. Karen clutched David, and Emily grabbed Jake's hand, pulling him toward the kitchen. David grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the noise. The beam landed on the back door just as it swung open with a deafening crash. Snow swirled in, and there it was, the figure, more solid, more terrifying than before. Its hood fell back slightly, revealing a face that was pale, almost waxen, with hollow eyes that gleamed with something unholy. It stepped forward, slow, deliberate. The smell of decay hit them first, then the chilling realization that this was no ordinary intruder. David shouted, swinging the flashlight, but the figure didn't react. It raised a hand, pointing at them, and a low, grating voice filled the room. "You celebrated while I was gone. You forgot me. But I remember." The temperature plummeted, breath freezing in their throats. The candles flickered out. Emily felt something brush against her ankle, something cold, like ice. She screamed, and in that instant, the figure vanished, leaving the family huddled in darkness, trembling and alone. By morning, the storm had passed. The town resumed its normal cheer, but the Thompsons were forever changed. Windows were locked, doors barred, and every night they heard the faintest scratching at the walls, the soft whisper of singing in the dark. Emily would later learn that the figure resembled an old legend in Haverhill, a man who had died alone on Christmas Eve decades ago, furious that the town had forgotten him. Some said he returned each year, seeking acknowledgement, seeking revenge for being ignored. No one else in the town ever saw him. No one else heard the scraping in the snow. But the Thompsons, every Christmas, knew that some things didn't rest, and some memories of betrayal lingered long past death. And every year, Emily checked the oak tree outside the window, wondering if the shadow she saw would finally come inside. Story the end. The snow had started falling lightly that December evening in the small town of Pinecrest, a place where every home glittered with Christmas lights and the air smelled of pine and cinnamon. The Thompson family had been preparing for weeks, decorating their house, buying gifts, and baking cookies. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas, the kind of memory they'd all remember fondly for years. But that year, something invisible had slipped through the frosty streets, something no one could have anticipated. Sarah Thompson, a mother in her late 30s, was busy in the kitchen frosting sugar cookies with her 8-year-old son, Jake. Their laughter echoed softly as the oven hummed in the background. "Mom, I think this one looks like a ghost," Jake said, holding up a cookie covered in too much icing. Sarah smiled and ruffled his hair, unaware that outside the warm glow of their home, a figure was watching through the frost-covered window. It started subtly. A few small things went missing, an ornament here, a scarf there, but the family assumed they were just misplaced in the holiday chaos. Then, late one night, Sarah woke to the sound of soft, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. Her husband, Mark, snored beside her, oblivious. Grabbing her robe, she crept to the top of the stairs and peered down. The living room was empty, the Christmas tree glowing softly with its colored lights, ornaments reflecting tiny, eerie shapes. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to sleepwalking or imagination and returned to bed. A few nights later, Mark noticed something strange while he was bringing in firewood. One of the neighbors' houses, which should have been dark, had its lights flickering. He saw what looked like a tall, thin man standing motionless in the yard, watching their house. When Mark called out, the figure disappeared into the night. He tried telling himself it was a trick of the shadows, but an unease settled in his chest. On Christmas Eve, the family gathered in the living room. Jake tore open presents, squealing with delight, while Sarah and Mark exchanged smiles over their child's excitement. But when the last gift had been opened, a chilling noise interrupted the celebration. A slow, deliberate knocking on the front door. Sarah froze. They weren't expecting anyone else. Mark cautiously approached and looked through the peephole. Outside, there was no one, just the falling snow swirling in the dim light of the street lamp. He opened the door, half expecting a prankster, but the porch was empty. The only thing there was a small, hand-carved wooden figurine, a grotesque little elf with black eyes that seemed almost human. Jake ran to pick it up, laughing nervously, but when he touched it, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder, and the lights flickered. "Probably just a weird gift," Sarah said, forcing a laugh, but her voice trembled. That night, Jake didn't sleep well. He kept whispering about someone standing at the foot of his bed, watching him. Sarah entered his room multiple times, finding him huddled under the blankets, eyes wide, too scared to speak. Mark tried to dismiss it, blaming nightmares, but when he passed the hallway mirror, he swore he saw a shadow move behind him, a tall, unnaturally thin figure with long, claw-like fingers. Christmas morning arrived with bright sunlight, but the unease had only deepened. The family tried to carry on, eating breakfast and opening the rest of their gifts, but the atmosphere was tense, as if some invisible presence was pressing down on them. Then Sarah noticed something horrifying. The ornaments on the tree had shifted. Not just slightly. They were rearranged into patterns that looked like symbols, jagged and chaotic like some ancient language. Mark laughed nervously, trying to convince everyone it was Jake or a prank, but the boy insisted he hadn't touched the tree. "It's watching us," he whispered, shivering. That night, the air turned icy and the lights in the house flickered more violently. The family huddled together in the living room, listening to the wind howl outside. And then the knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent, echoing through the walls. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was everywhere, surrounding them. Mark grabbed a baseball bat and cautiously moved toward the sound. When he opened the door to the basement, the stairs were empty, but at the bottom, something had scrawled itself into the wall with what looked like soot, the same jagged symbols from the tree ornaments. Sarah gasped. She had never seen anything like it. Jake clung to her, muttering that the figure had been standing there, watching, always just out of reach. The power went out suddenly, plunging the house into darkness. In the faint glow of the fireplace, they saw it. The figure, tall, impossibly thin, with long fingers and a face obscured by shadow, standing silently in the corner of the room. Its eyes glowed faintly red, fixed on Jake. Mark swung the bat and the figure disappeared, leaving behind a cold, oppressive silence. Over the next few days, things escalated. The snow outside never seemed to accumulate as it should. The air inside the house was thick and freezing, and Jake started drawing the symbols everywhere, in his notebooks, on the walls, even in the frost on the windows. The family began to fear sleep, afraid that the figure would come closer when their guard was down. Neighbors reported strange noises in the Thompson house, screams that faded into whispering, shadows moving across windows, and lights flickering in unnatural patterns. A pastor was called in, attempting to bless the house, but the moment he walked through the door, his face went pale, and he refused to enter further, muttering about an ancient evil that feeds on joy. By New Year's Eve, the family was on edge, barely eating or sleeping. They decided they had to leave Pinecrest for a while. Packing their essentials, they drove away with Jake in the back seat, still clutching the grotesque wooden elf that had started it all. The town seemed deceptively quiet as they left, the snow sparkling like nothing had ever happened. They returned 2 weeks later, hoping that a break had ended whatever nightmare had begun in their home. But the house was worse. The ornaments had rearranged themselves again, and the walls were covered with more of the jagged symbols. In the corner of the living room, the wooden elf sat upright, its black eyes glinting as if mocking them. Jake refused to go near it, whispering that it had been waiting for them and that it had friends now. By that night, the figure returned, no longer hesitant or distant. It moved freely through the rooms, scratching patterns into the walls, staring at Jake with its glowing eyes. Desperate, Mark tried to destroy the elf, smashing it with a hammer, but its shards reassembled overnight, perfectly whole, and the figure lingered longer, more insistent than before. In the end, the Thompsons abandoned their home. They left everything behind, taking only what they could carry and never looking back. Pinecrest police investigated, finding only the shattered remains of the ornaments and the marks in the walls, but no sign of the figure or the elf. The house remained empty, yet locals reported lights flickering, shadows moving, and whispering in the dead of winter nights. Years later, Jake, now a teenager, admitted he had never truly escaped. He had nightmares every Christmas, seeing the figure in the corner of his room, the elf always beside it, staring. The symbols haunted his dreams, carved into the walls of his memory, a reminder that some things never leave, no matter how far you run or how bright the Christmas lights glow. And in Pinecrest, the house still stands, silent during the day but alive at night, waiting for the next family to experience its cold, watchful terror. Story the end. The snow fell hard that Christmas Eve in the small town of Pine Creek, turning the streets into slick sheets of ice. Everyone was bustling around, finishing last-minute shopping, wrapping presents, and trying to make it home before the snowstorm trapped them. The Johnson family, David, his wife Laura, and their two kids, Emily and Jacob, had just finished decorating their house. Lights twinkled along the eaves, a freshly cut pine tree stood proudly in the living room, and stockings hung from the mantel. Everything looked perfect on the outside, but David had a nagging feeling all day that something wasn't right. It started small. A shadow he thought he saw flitting past the living room window, or a noise that might have been the wind rattling the old siding. Laura laughed it off, saying it was just nerves because of the storm, but David couldn't shake it. He had a strange sense of being watched. As night fell, the wind howled and the snow thickened. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. David grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the circuit breaker, feeling the chill creep up his spine. That's when he heard it, a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap coming from the living room. His heart jumped, but he told himself it was just the tree branches scraping against the window. He checked the living room and found nothing. Yet the tapping continued, slower now, almost like footsteps pacing across the wooden floor. He called out to Laura, but only silence answered. She was upstairs checking on the kids. David's unease grew. He moved closer to the sound, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Suddenly the tapping stopped. The silence was heavier than the storm outside, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then he saw it. A smear of dirt along the windowsill, too high for a child to reach, leading toward the door. He froze. Someone, or something, had been inside. David crept upstairs, every step careful, every floorboard groaning under his weight. He found Laura checking on Emily and Jacob, who were asleep, oblivious to the storm. Laura smiled at him, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just the wind," she said again, but David noticed her hands were trembling. Before he could say anything, they both heard it. A whisper, low and guttural, coming from the attic. David grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet. "Stay here with the kids," he told Laura, who nodded silently, her face pale. He climbed the attic stairs, each step creaking under his weight, heart hammering in his chest. The attic door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he saw the shadows shift, almost alive in the flashlight's beam. Then he saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, with glowing eyes staring at him from the far corner. It hissed and darted behind the boxes. David's flashlight flickered, and when it came back, the figure was gone. He rushed downstairs to find Laura screaming. The kids were gone. The stockings hung from the mantel, but their small forms were missing, and the living room had been torn apart. Presents ripped open, tinsel scattered like snow. Panic consumed him. He ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. Every window was locked from the inside. He banged on the doors, yelling, calling for the kids, for Laura, but the storm outside swallowed his cries. Then came the voice. It was faint, almost melodic, like a twisted version of Silent Night. "David?" it called. His wife's voice? He wasn't sure. He followed it to the kitchen, where he found the refrigerator door wide open. Inside, a small pair of boots, Emily's, stood upright, glowing faintly in the darkness. The voice came again, closer this time. "David." He spun around. Behind him, Laura was standing there, eyes black, teeth sharp, and a smile that made his stomach turn. "Why did you leave us?" she hissed. David backed away, but the figure of Laura lunged, her hands reaching for him. He swung the bat, and it passed through her like smoke. The house groaned and shook, as if alive, swallowing the light, twisting the shadows into forms that whispered and screamed. He ran to the attic, hoping to find the kids there. The attic was a nightmare of broken toys and shattered ornaments, a maze of shadows that moved and whispered. He called their names, his voice cracking, but all that answered was the storm and the laughter. children's laughter, distorted and cruel. Then he saw them, Emily and Jacob, standing in the far corner, eyes wide and empty. "Daddy," they said together, their voices hollow. David ran to them, but as he reached out, the floor beneath him gave way. He fell into darkness, tumbling through the walls of the house, the sound of laughter echoing around him. When he landed, it was in a room that shouldn't exist, a room filled with Christmas trees, all wrapped in shadows, ornaments glinting like eyes. The kids were there, their hands reaching for him, but at each time he tried to touch them, they dissolved into smoke. The figure of Laura appeared again, floating above the ground. "It's our time now," she said. "We're all together," David screamed, pounding at the walls, trying to wake up, but the house itself seemed to breathe around him. Every corner held a shadow, every shadow a whisper, every whisper a memory twisted into horror. He saw other families too, long gone, trapped in the walls, their screams muffled by the storm that raged outside. The snow continued to fall outside, silent and beautiful, covering the town in a peaceful white. By morning, the Johnson house was quiet. The neighbors called when no one answered the door. Police arrived, breaking down the front door, but the house was empty, no sign of David, Laura, or the kids. The presents remained under the tree, perfectly wrapped. The stockings hung as if untouched. Only a faint smear of dirt on the windowsill hinted at the terror that had occurred. The town whispered about the Johnsons for years, a cautionary tale of a perfect family lost on Christmas Eve. Children would dare each other to peek into the windows of the abandoned house, swearing they saw shadows move and lights flicker. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, calling their names in the softest of tones. The police never solved it. The storm had covered everything, leaving no trace but the story. And every year when the snow began to fall in Pine Creek, the townspeople felt the same uneasy chill, as if someone or something was watching, waiting for the next family to mistake the beauty of Christmas for safety. Story the end. The snow had been falling for days in the small town of Pinewood, Minnesota, turning the streets into a white blur and the trees into frozen sculptures. Most of the town was excited, the way small towns always are when Christmas comes, but for the Thompson family, the holiday felt heavy this year. The previous Christmas, Dan Thompson, the father, had lost his job at the factory. Though he had found work again, the financial strain lingered. The house was still warm, thanks to old but working radiators, but the air inside felt thick with tension. Dan's wife, Karen, was trying to keep spirits up for their two kids, Emma, 10, and Charlie, 7. She had insisted on decorating the Christmas tree earlier than usual, hoping the glittering lights would distract from the unspoken worries. The tree sat in the corner of the living room, its ornaments carefully arranged. The fake snow dusted over its branches. Outside, the wind howled, making the old wooden walls creak, but inside, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. It was Christmas Eve when the first unsettling incident happened. Dan had gone out to clear the driveway of snow with the old snowblower. The kids were inside, watching a holiday movie, while Karen wrapped last-minute presents. She heard a knock at the front door, which was unusual. At this hour, no one normally visited. When she opened it, there was no one there. Just a small package sitting on the doorstep, dusted in snow. Karen brought it inside. There was no return address, just her name scrawled in uneven handwriting. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a small wooden ornament, shaped like a snowman, but its face was twisted in a grotesque expression. A shiver ran down her spine. She shook it off, assuming it was some kind of prank from a neighbor, and put it on the tree, hiding it among the other ornaments. That night, as everyone slept, the house seemed unusually quiet. But around 2 a.m., Karen woke to the sound of faint whispering. She sat up, listening. It was coming from the living room. When she reached the doorway, she froze. The snowman ornament was no longer on the tree. It was sitting on the coffee table, facing the hallway as if watching her. The whispering grew louder, almost like multiple voices speaking at once. Karen's heart pounded as she picked up the ornament. The moment she touched it, the whispering stopped. She hurried back to bed, convinced she had imagined it. The next morning, Christmas Day, things worsened. Emma and Charlie were unusually quiet, refusing to open presents right away. They kept glancing toward the tree where the snowman ornament sat, now back on its branch, though Karen was sure she hadn't put it there. Dan laughed it off, attributing it to the kids being tired or maybe a trick of the night. But when he went to hang a new decoration on the tree, he noticed something chilling. The ornament's face looked subtly different. It was grinning now, a grin that hadn't been there before. The family tried to enjoy the day anyway. They had breakfast, exchanged gifts, and even put on some holiday music. But Karen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house seemed colder than usual despite the heat running, and every time she glanced at the tree, the snowman seemed to move slightly, just enough to make her heart skip a beat. By the evening, Dan started noticing it too. He was in the kitchen when he heard the sound of footsteps upstairs, but everyone was in the living room eating Christmas cookies. He called out, "Hello?" but no one answered. The steps grew heavier, louder, like someone pacing above them. Dan went upstairs to check, finding nothing. The bedrooms were all empty, doors closed as usual. When he returned downstairs, he noticed the snowman ornament on the mantel, far from the tree. Panic began to creep into Karen's mind. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe the kids were moving it as a prank. But Emma and Charlie insisted they hadn't touched it. Dan was skeptical, but uneasy. That night, as they all tried to sleep, the whispering returned, louder, more insistent, coming from every corner of the house. Around midnight, Charlie screamed. Dan and Karen rushed into his room to find him pointing at the corner, trembling. "It's looking at me," he cried. There was nothing there, at least nothing visible, but the shadow cast by the Christmas tree seemed distorted, stretching unnaturally toward the boy. The snowman ornament was gone again. The family huddled together in the living room, too scared to stay in their rooms. That's when Dan noticed footprints in the snow outside, leading to the front door. But there was something odd. They didn't appear human. They were small, too narrow, and the shape was wrong, like a mix between a child's shoe and an animal's paw. The tracks ended abruptly at the doorstep. Over the next few hours, the occurrences escalated. Objects moved on their own. The lights flickered. The whispering voices seemed to chant something. Karen couldn't make out the words, only the tone, which was mocking, cruel. The snowman ornament appeared in every room, enough always facing them, always grinning wider than before. Dan decided to call the police, fearing a break-in. But when they arrived, they found no signs of forced entry. The house was as they'd left it, except for the ornament, which the officers found in the attic, lying on the floor as if it had fallen from the ceiling. "Maybe someone is playing a prank," one officer said, though his voice lacked conviction. But Dan knew better. There was something unnatural about it, something old, something angry. By late morning, Emma and Charlie refused to speak, their eyes wide, unblinking, staring at the tree. Karen, desperate, took the ornament outside and threw it into the snowbank. She thought that would be enough. But that night, the house felt alive in a sinister way. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the whispering was louder than ever, almost chanting. Then the lights went out completely. In the darkness, the family could hear it. Footsteps pacing, soft but deliberate, circling them. And then, a voice. Low, hollow, coming from inside the walls. "You can't leave me," it said. The family screamed, trying to escape to the car, but the doors wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself refused to let them leave. The windows were frosted over from the inside, though they had been clear hours earlier. The snowman ornament appeared in the doorway, standing on its own, impossibly tall now, its eyes glowing faint red. Its grin was impossibly wide. Karen grabbed her children and tried to smash the ornament, but her hands passed through it as if it were smoke. Dan tried to punch it, but his fists hit nothing, the air thick and cold. The house shook violently, and the whispering turned into screaming. Thousands of voices, all layered on top of one another, crying, laughing, taunting. By dawn, the neighbors noticed the house was silent. Too silent. The snow was undisturbed. They called the police again. When officers entered, they found the house empty. Completely empty. No furniture, no family, nothing. Only the Christmas tree remained, perfectly decorated, and the snowman ornament sitting on the top branch, smiling down. The Thompson family was never seen again. The house stood abandoned for years. A local legend whispered about every Christmas. People who dared walk past said they could hear soft whispering through the walls, especially on snowy nights. Some claimed the snowman ornament moved if you looked away. Others swore they saw small footprints in the snow, leading up to the doorstep, then vanishing into thin air. Locals eventually learned not to enter the house. Anyone who tried reported a sense of overwhelming dread, voices calling their names, doors slamming shut on their own. The ornament was never removed, never destroyed. It seemed to wait, year after year, for the next family to set their eyes on it, to unwrap its curse, to bring it back to life. Stories spread about other houses in Pinewood, homes that received mysterious packages, ornaments, or figurines, always around Christmas. Families who accepted them reported similar events: whispering, objects moving, shadows stretching unnaturally, voices calling from nowhere. None of the victims were ever found, but every year the town felt a little colder, a little quieter, as if something unseen watched from the snow and the dark. Even today, years later, people in Pinewood lock their doors and avoid the Thompson house when the snow falls. Some claim if you stand close enough on Christmas Eve, you can hear the whispers of the lost family calling for help, echoing through the cold night. And if you look up at the tree through the frosted window, some swear you can see the snowman's eyes glinting red, its grin wider than ever, waiting. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Millersville, a sleepy, snow-covered corner of Pennsylvania where everyone knew everyone else, and the streets were lined with twinkling lights reflecting off icy sidewalks. The smell of pine and wood smoke filled the air, and families were preparing for the night with festive dinners and last-minute wrapping. The Thompson family's house, an old Victorian on the edge of town, seemed particularly warm that evening. Inside, Sarah Thompson was bustling around the kitchen, checking the ham in the oven, while her husband, Mark, adjusted the lights on the tree. Their two kids, Emily and Noah, were arguing over who got to put the star on top. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Too normal, almost. Earlier that week, strange things had started happening around town. At first, it was small. The lights on someone's house would flicker, a snowman mysteriously knocked over, or a neighbor's Christmas wreath ripped off the door overnight. Most people laughed it off as pranksters or bad luck, but Mark had noticed something off when he drove home from work on Friday. As he passed the old, abandoned Miller farm at the outskirts of town, he swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the fence. It was tall, and its silhouette looked almost like a man, but there was something wrong about the posture, something unnatural. He shook his head and blamed it on fatigue. Now, as Christmas Eve drew closer to night, the Thompsons' house seemed to hum with an odd energy. Sarah placed the ham on the counter, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted towel, and glanced at the clock. "Almost time to head over to Grandma's," she said. But before Mark could respond, a loud knock echoed through the house. "Who could that be at this hour?" Mark muttered, moving cautiously toward the door. When he opened it, no one was there. Just a pile of snow, disturbed slightly, as if someone had been standing there, but there were no footprints leading away. Frowning, he closed the door and locked it. The kids didn't notice at first. They were busy tearing through wrapping paper for a surprise gift their parents had hidden. But soon they began whispering to each other. Emily said she saw someone in the window upstairs, even though she was alone in the living room. Noah swore he heard a soft, jingling sound, like a sleigh bell, coming from the attic. Mark tried to dismiss it. "It's just the wind, kids. You're imagining things." Sarah wasn't so sure. She had a creeping sense of unease that she couldn't shake. She tried to focus on the Christmas preparations, but a chill ran down her spine whenever she heard the wind moan through the cracks in the old house. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Mark and Sarah settled in the living room with a bottle of wine. The fire crackled warmly, but the shadows it cast seemed to twist and stretch in ways that made Sarah uneasy. She shook her head. "I don't know why, but I can't shake the feeling that something's watching us." Mark laughed lightly. "It's Christmas Eve. Everyone's in the spirit. You're just spooked by the weather." Just as he said that, the faint sound of jingling bells came from the front of the house. They both froze. It was slow, deliberate, almost measured. Not like Santa arriving, more like something pacing. Mark got up to investigate, grabbing the fireplace poker. He crept to the door and peeked through the frosted glass. Nothing, only the snow-covered yard. He exhaled slowly, trying to calm himself, but when he turned back, he noticed something strange on the living room floor. Tiny footprints in the dust on the wooden floor, leading from the hallway into the kitchen. They were small, child-sized, but they weren't quite human. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow. Sarah's eyes widened. "Mark, what is that?" Before he could answer, a loud bang came from the attic, followed by the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps. The house seemed to shake. The fire flickered violently, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, forming shapes that looked disturbingly like figures watching them. Mark grabbed Sarah's hand. "We need to get out, now." They grabbed the kids and ran toward the back door, but it was locked from the outside. The windows, too, were frozen shut, impossible to break. The jingling grew louder, now accompanied by a guttural whispering that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Emily and Noah clung to their parents, trembling. "It's Santa," Emily whimpered. "He's mad at us." "No, honey," Sarah whispered back, her voice shaking. "It's something else." The footsteps on the stairs grew closer, slow and deliberate. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. Mark moved to check the attic, the poker raised in front of him. He slowly opened the attic door and the stairs were empty. But when he looked down at the floor, the tiny footprints had multiplied, spreading across the living room, the hallway, and toward the tree. And there, under the tree, lay a single gift they hadn't bought. It was wrapped in coarse brown paper, tied with a string that looked more like dried sinew than ribbon. Sarah's stomach dropped. "We didn't buy that," she whispered. Mark slowly approached it and knelt to examine the tag. In jagged letters, scrawled as if by claws, it read, "Merry Christmas, from someone who's watching." The fire in the fireplace roared suddenly, sending sparks into the room. The tree lights flickered on and off, and then all at once, every window in the house slammed shut. The sound was deafening. Sarah screamed, clutching the kids. Then the figure appeared. At first, it was just a shadow against the far wall, but as their eyes adjusted, they could see a tall, gaunt man, or something human-like, standing there. Its eyes glowed faintly red in the dim light. It didn't move like a normal person. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles, and its mouth, it didn't smile. It stretched into a thin, lipless slash across its face. The creature tilted its head, as if curious. Then, with a sudden speed that made Mark stumble backward, it was at the tree, tearing apart the ornaments, scattering the gifts. The children cried out. Mark swung the poker, connecting with the creature's shoulder, but it made no sound, no reaction, as if nothing could harm it. Sarah grabbed Emily and Noah and ran to the kitchen. The creature didn't follow, but the whispering filled the room again, now echoing from every corner. "You can't hide. You can't escape. You've been watched for so long." Panic set in. Sarah realized that the house itself seemed alive, creaking and groaning in rhythm with the whispering. Cabinets slammed open, the chandelier swayed violently, and the fireplace belched black smoke. The children screamed, and for a moment Sarah thought they were going to die in that cursed house. Then the creature's voice joined the whispers, low and raspy. All gifts must be unwrapped, all secrets revealed. Mark, trembling, remembered something. There had been an old diary he found in the attic weeks ago, belonging to the previous owner of the house, a man named Henry Miller. In it, Henry had written about a spirit that came every Christmas, a shadow that rewarded those it watched and punished those who hid secrets or sinned. It demanded honesty, demanded fear. Mark had dismissed it as a story, but now he realized the diary had been a warning. Gathering all his courage, Mark shouted, "We're not hiding anything. We're not keeping secrets." The creature paused. Its glowing eyes studied them, tilting its head again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to fade, blending into the shadows of the room. The whispering stopped. The windows unlocked themselves, and the strange gift under the tree disappeared. The house was silent once more. The fire crackled normally, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Sarah could breathe. The next morning, the Thompsons left the house and went to Grandma's, telling themselves it was a nightmare, a shared hallucination brought on by stress and holiday chaos. But when Mark returned later that day to retrieve something he forgot, he noticed faint scratch marks on the walls, leading from the attic to the tree. And in the kitchen, a single bell sat on the counter, small and rusted, that neither he nor Sarah had ever seen before. The town of Millersville never spoke of it. People chalked it up to winter winds, old houses settling, and kids imagining things. But the Thompsons knew the truth. Every Christmas Eve, something watched. Every Christmas Eve, it came for a reason they couldn't fully understand. And every Christmas, it reminded them that some gifts weren't meant to be opened, some secrets weren't meant to be kept, and some visitors weren't meant to leave. Years later, when Emily and Noah were grown and had families of their own, they would remember that Christmas, the fear, the shadows, the whispers, and they would lock their doors tight every Christmas Eve, just in case it ever returned. Story the end, the wind was biting that Christmas Eve in rural Vermont, rattling the shutters of the small clapboard house at the end of Pine Hollow Road. Snow had been falling steadily all day, thick and wet, piling up against the porch steps. Inside, the Peterson family tried to keep warm by the fireplace, though the chill had a way of seeping through the old walls and lingering in the corners. Mark Peterson sat in an armchair, nursing a beer, while his wife, Linda, fussed with the Christmas tree lights. Their son, Ben, 12, and daughter, Sophie, 8, were sprawled on the floor assembling a model train a rattle around the base of the tree. It was the first Christmas in the house since moving from Boston, and Linda had insisted on keeping things traditional, hoping it would ease Mark's lingering grief after his father passed earlier that year. But the house felt wrong, empty, echoing as if it were holding its breath. Around 8 o'clock, the lights flickered once, then died. Mark muttered under his breath and went to the fuse box in the basement, leaving Linda with the children. The house groaned and creaked in the wind, a sound that made Sophie huddle closer to her mother. "Mom, did you hear that?" Sophie whispered, pointing toward the back of the house. Linda strained her ears. There was a faint scratching, like nails on wood, coming from the kitchen. "It's probably just the wind," she said, trying to sound confident. "Or the pipes." But the sound persisted, soft and deliberate, growing louder, closer, until it seemed to come from inside the pantry. Linda took a deep breath and opened the door, half expecting to find a raccoon or some other animal. The shelves were empty, nothing stirred. She shut the door and tried to brush off the unease crawling up her spine. When Mark returned, he had the lights back on, though the basement smelled faintly of something metallic. "Probably just some snow in the wiring," he said, shrugging, but the feeling of unease lingered. Later, while the children were brushing their teeth, a knock sounded at the front door. Slow, deliberate, 3 sharp taps. Mark frowned. Nobody came out this far in the woods on Christmas Eve. He opened the door to find a man standing in the snow, wearing a dark coat, a red scarf, and a Santa hat. His beard was thin and unkempt, his eyes hidden in shadow. "Merry Christmas," the man said, voice strangely hollow. "I've got a little something for the children." Mark stepped back instinctively. We weren't expecting." The man held up a wrapped package. "No problem. Just a gift. For tonight only." Without waiting for an answer, he placed it on the porch and stepped back into the darkness. Mark closed the door slowly, shivering, and set the package by the tree. The children squealed with excitement. Sophie tore the wrapping paper with glee. Inside was a small, intricately carved wooden box about the size of a lunchbox with strange symbols etched into the sides. Ben peered inside. A faint coppery smell rose from the box, and the children wrinkled their noses. "It smells weird," Sophie said, holding her nose. "Probably just old wood," Linda said, though her voice lacked conviction. She set the box on the coffee table. The moment Mark touched the box, the lights flickered again. A low hum began, almost imperceptible at first, then rising in pitch until it filled the room. The carved symbols on the box seemed to shift, like they were moving under the surface. Mark recoiled, but the children were drawn closer, mesmerized. "Turn it on," Ben whispered. Mark frowned. There was no switch. He pressed the lid, and it sprang open on its own. Inside, a small mechanical figure of Santa sat, winding up and beginning to move. The toy sang, a twisted version of Jingle Bells, notes stretched and distorted, echoing unnaturally through the room. Linda froze. The room had grown inexplicably cold. Frost began forming on the windows, spreading in delicate, unnatural patterns. The fireplace crackled weakly, as if fighting against the cold. Then came the whispering, barely audible at first, like someone talking just beyond the edge of hearing. But it grew louder, circling the room, coming from the corners, the floorboards, even the walls. Words formed in Linda's mind. Open the door. Let us in. Sophie clutched Ben's arm. Mom, it's saying things. Mark tried to shut the box, but it refused to close. The figure inside Santa waved, slowly, deliberately, and the eyes seemed almost human, glinting with a faint red light. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting into shapes that should not exist. A sudden crash from the kitchen made everyone jump. Linda grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the source. The pantry door was swinging open and shut on its own. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, like something was moving inside. Mark shouted, "Get back!" But it was too late. From the pantry, a figure emerged. It wore a tattered Santa suit, face pale and frozen in a grotesque smile. Its movements were jerky, puppet-like, but unnervingly fast. Behind it, more shapes appeared, thin and elongated, moving in the corners of the room, just out of clear sight. The children screamed as the lights flickered violently. The toy Santa's song slowed, stretching and distorting, becoming almost a growl. The room felt alive, pulsating with cold, with whispers turning into screams. Linda grabbed Sophie and Ben, running for the front door, but the handle rattled as if the house itself were resisting. Mark tried to push past one of the shadowy figures, only to have it melt through his hands like smoke, leaving a trail of frost on his skin. In a panic, Linda remembered the fireplace. She grabbed the box and threw it into the flames. The fire roared, crackling unnaturally as if the box was feeding on it. The shadow figures recoiled, screeching, a sound that tore at the eardrums, animalistic and human all at once. The house shook violently. Windows shattered, ice splintering across the floor. Linda, Mark, and the children were thrown to the ground. Then, as suddenly as it began, the storm of terror stopped. The box was gone, and the house was silent, except for the faint smell of burnt wood and iron. Outside, the snow had stopped. The trees were still. No footprints, no signs of struggle. The Petersons were left shaken, huddled together on the cold floor. When neighbors checked the house the next morning, they found it empty, though signs of life had been recent. No gift boxes, no strange carvings, no traces of the shadow figures. The Peterson family had vanished without a trace. Authorities assumed foul play or a family dispute, but nothing ever explained the odd frost patterns, the melted wax in unnatural shapes, or the faint, lingering sound of distorted Christmas music drifting on the wind. Years later, locals in Pine Hollow speak of a Christmas shadow. Every year, around midnight on Christmas Eve, some report seeing figures in the snow, thin and pale, wearing tattered Santa suits, moving silently through the trees. Occasionally, a strange package appears on a doorstep, a small carved wooden box that hums with an eerie melody. No one who opens it is ever seen again. Some say it's punishment for despair, a way the holiday itself takes notice of those weighed down by sorrow. Others believe it's something older, a spirit that uses joy and tradition to lure families into its cold, frozen world. Nobody knows why it happens, or why it chooses the families it does. But every Christmas, the story circulates, whispered in local bars and around fireplaces, a warning. Don't open gifts from strangers in the snow, and never ever touch a music box that sings on its own. The Peterson house stands empty to this day, snow piling high around its porch, lights unlit, the air around it eerily still. Yet every year a faint, warped carol can sometimes be heard drifting through the woods, carrying the scent of cedar and iron, reminding the town that Christmas joy can sometimes come at a cost far worse than anyone could imagine. Story the end. The snow had been falling in thick, heavy sheets all morning, blanketing the small town of Millersville in a pristine, deceptive layer of white. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional car crunching over the packed snow and the distant jingle of holiday decorations swaying in the cold wind. It was Christmas Eve, and normally the town would be buzzing with last-minute shoppers, families carrying presents, and the scent of baked goods drifting from every open door. But tonight felt different. There was an eerie stillness, as if the snow itself were holding its breath. Jessica Carmichael pulled her coat tighter around her and trudged through the drifts on her way to the small grocery store at the corner of Main and 3rd. Her kids were home with her husband, Greg, and she had promised them a special dinner, a rare indulgence since both she and Greg worked long hours at the local hospital. The store was nearly empty, just a few shoppers scattered across the aisles, their faces pale and tense. She chalked it up to the weather, the town being buried under several feet of snow, and went about picking up the last ingredients she needed. As she reached for a can of cranberry sauce, she noticed a man standing in the corner of the store. He wasn't browsing, just standing, staring at the ceiling with a vacant expression. Jessica felt a shiver crawl down her spine. There was something unsettling about him, though she couldn't put her finger on it. He wore a thick, dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face, hiding his eyes. Something about the way he didn't move, didn't speak, made the hair on her neck stand up. She quickly grabbed the cranberries, muttering a polite, rushed, "Excuse me," as she passed. The man didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. The checkout line was short, and Jessica was relieved. As the cashier rang up her items, she glanced back, half expecting to see the man gone. But he was still there, frozen in the corner, silent, unmoving. She shook her head, telling herself she was just being paranoid. It was Christmas Eve. People were tired, stressed. There was nothing more to it than that. The drive home was treacherous. The snow had piled high, and the roads were slick with ice. Jessica's car crept along slowly, tires skidding slightly on the frozen pavement. The radio crackled with static, then settled into a soft Christmas tune that sounded too happy for the night. When she finally pulled into the driveway, her relief was palpable. She parked, grabbed the bags, and hurried inside. The warmth of the house was immediate, but the unease she had felt at the store lingered. Inside, the house smelled of pine and cinnamon from the small tree Greg had decorated earlier that week. The kids were playing near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, their laughter echoing through the living room. Jessica smiled, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. She set the groceries down and began preparing dinner. Everything seemed normal. Too normal, maybe. She tried to focus on the cooking, chopping vegetables, and stirring sauces, but every so often a strange sound made her pause. A thump, like something heavy hitting the roof, or a tap at the window. She would glance outside, but the yard was empty, covered in snow, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. Greg arrived home later than usual, tired but in good spirits. He kissed Jessica on the cheek and ruffled the kids' hair. Dinner was quiet at first, the family enjoying the warmth and the food, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. When she went to clear the dishes, she thought she heard footsteps in the hall behind her. Greg was still at the table, reading the kids a story, so she assumed it was her imagination. But the steps came again, slower this time, deliberate. She called out, "Greg, did you hear that?" No answer. The footsteps stopped. Jessica's heart raced. She went to check the windows, making sure they were all locked, and every single one was. That's when she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line in the yard. At first, she thought it was a neighbor, maybe one of the town's teens playing in the snow, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, watching. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and when she looked again, it was gone. Trying to calm herself, she told Greg about it, but he laughed it off. "You've been working too much, Jess. Stress is making you see things," he said. She wanted to believe him, and for a while, she did. But as night fell and the family went to bed, the unease returned. Jessica lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind moan around the house. That's when the first scream came. It wasn't human, not really, a high-pitched, guttural sound echoing through the neighborhood. She jolted out of bed and ran to the kids' room, but it was empty. Both of them were sound asleep, untouched. She checked the windows again. Nothing. And then she saw it. The man from the store outside her window, standing in the snow. He wasn't moving, but his presence was overwhelming, pressing in on her from the cold darkness outside. She gasped, backing away, and suddenly he was gone. She told herself it was the shadows, the flickering lights from the Christmas tree playing tricks on her. She tried to sleep, but every few minutes she heard a thump from the roof, a tap on the window, the soft crunch of snow under heavy boots. By midnight, she could no longer ignore it. She woke Greg, insisting that someone was outside. Reluctantly, he went to the door with a flashlight. They shined it across the yard. Nothing. No footprints, no figure, just the unbroken blanket of snow. Greg shook his head and returned to bed, but Jessica remained on edge. Something was wrong. Hours later, around 3 a.m., the kids woke screaming. They both claimed to have seen a man at the window, a man with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. Jessica felt her own blood run cold. She ran to the living room, flashlight in hand, and saw the sliding glass door slightly ajar, though she was certain she had locked it. The snow outside was disturbed, prints leading away from the house toward the dense woods at the edge of the property. Greg grabbed a baseball bat and went to check, but the figure was gone, leaving nothing behind but footprints disappearing into the shadows. They spent the rest of the night barricading themselves in the living room, huddled together, watching the snowfall. Every so often, they would hear scratching at the doors, tapping at the windows. Even low whispers carried on the wind. Jessica was terrified, but she couldn't leave the kids. Leaving the house meant venturing into the storm, into the unknown figure that had been haunting them for hours. Morning came, but relief did not. The snowstorm had stopped, but outside the windows, the world felt wrong. Trees bent at unnatural angles, broken branches scattered across the yard. And then Jessica saw it, on the front door, etched into the frost, a message, "Merry Christmas," written in long, jagged scratches that could only have been made with claws. Her heart pounded. She ran outside, calling for anyone at all, but the yard was empty. No footprints except their own, no sign of the figure. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Over the next week, the Carmichaels tried to return to normal, but things never felt right. Objects moved on their own, doors creaked open, shadows lingered where none should be. The kids refused to sleep in their room, claiming they could see him in the corners of the house. Jessica started waking to whispers in the hallways, to scratches on the windows at night. Greg refused to leave the house alone, convinced that whatever had been there on Christmas Eve hadn't really left. By the time the new year came, the small town of Millersville was buzzing with news of strange happenings. Other families reported odd sightings, sounds, and scratches on their homes. Local authorities were baffled, and the story of the Carmichaels spread like wildfire. The man from the store had never been identified. No one had seen him again, not in the weeks that followed, though his presence lingered in every snowstorm, every winter night. Every Christmas since then, Jessica insists, she sees him at least once, just a glimpse. A shadow at the edge of the yard, a tap at the window, a whisper in the wind. The kids, now grown, refuse to return home for the holidays. Greg sleeps with a bat under the bed every December, and every year, when the first snow falls, she remembers that night and feels the same icy terror, that somewhere in the snow, he's still watching, still waiting, and still planning his next Christmas visit. Story the end. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 days straight in the small town of Maplewood, New Hampshire. The streets were buried under thick layers of white, and the soft glow of Christmas lights on every house made the town look like a picture-perfect postcard. But perfection has a way of hiding darkness, and that year it hid something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. It started on Christmas Eve. The Richardson family, Mark, his wife Emily, and their 2 children, Hannah and Ben, had just finished decorating their tree. They had spent the day baking cookies and hanging stockings, the house smelling of cinnamon and pine. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass and tugging at the curtains, but inside, everything felt safe. That sense of safety was about to be shattered. Mark was in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, when he heard the faint sound of a bell. He frowned. They didn't have a bell outside. He stepped onto the porch to see the fresh snowfall glistening under the porch light. Nothing moved except the snowflakes. Shaking his head, he went back inside, attributing the sound to the wind or perhaps a trick of his mind. Later that evening, while Emily was tucking the kids into bed, Hannah complained about hearing someone whispering her name. "It's just your imagination, sweetie," Emily said, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. But when she turned to Ben, he said nothing, though his wide eyes reflected the faint light of the nightlight. Something wasn't right. It wasn't right. Mark and Emily tried to dismiss it. After all, it was Christmas Eve, and children have wild imaginations. But the feeling of unease grew when the lights flickered repeatedly, though the storm outside had knocked out no power in the neighborhood. Then came the sound of footsteps on the roof, slow and deliberate, circling the house. Mark grabbed a flashlight and went to check the attic, but it was empty. Nothing could explain the scratches on the roof beams or the faint, acrid smell lingering in the air like burning hair. Around 11:30 p.m., Mark noticed the front door had a thin layer of frost around the edges, even though it had been locked. And then came the knock. Soft at first, then urgent. 3 distinct knocks, echoing through the silent house. Emily froze. "Mark?" "Don't," she whispered, but he approached, thinking it might be a neighbor needing help. Opening the door, there was no one, just the snow swirling in the cold wind. But etched into the snow in front of the door were footprints. Footprints that looked impossibly large and misshapen, almost like claws had pressed into the snow. They led to the tree in the front yard, which was now swaying, though no wind had touched it. And beneath it, a small wooden box had appeared, carved with symbols neither Mark nor Emily recognized. Curiosity fought with fear. Mark picked up the box and opened it, revealing a collection of objects wrapped in aged yellowed cloth. A dried animal paw, a few human teeth, and a small cracked porcelain doll with hollow eyes. As he held the doll, a whisper slithered through the house. "Take care of us! Take care!" Emily screamed. The lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. The sound of scraping, like fingernails against wood, started coming from the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. It grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to emerge from the very structure of the house. Hannah and Ben started crying, huddled under their blankets, but the whispers continued, now coming from inside their own rooms. Mark, desperate, tried to get everyone out of the house. They grabbed coats and flashlights and made their way to the front door. But as they approached, the box rolled from Mark's hands on its own, stopping at the threshold. A low, guttural growl filled the air, vibrating the walls. The family froze. Emily's phone wouldn't turn on. The cars in the driveway wouldn't start. It was as if the house itself had trapped them inside. Then came the knock at the window. Slow. Heavy. A face pressed against the glass, pale and contorted, with eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the Christmas light's glow. Hannah screamed, and the figure disappeared. But the fear lingered, pressing down like a heavy blanket over the family. Mark tried reasoning, telling himself it was hypothermia or cabin fever or maybe a prank. But when he lifted the box, the items inside had shifted. The doll's head was now facing him, its eyes glinting with a malicious intelligence. The teeth and paw seemed to twitch, and from somewhere deep in the house, a child's laughter echoed, except not his children's. It was a harsh, grating sound that made his skin crawl. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The house groaned, floorboards creaking as if someone or something was pacing above. The family stayed huddled together, praying, whispering, trying to ignore the voices that now called out not just from the walls, but from inside their own minds. Finally, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The snow had stopped falling. The air grew still. The box lay closed on the floor, untouched. The family, trembling, dared to move. But when they looked outside, the footprints in the snow had multiplied. They surrounded the house in a perfect circle, too large to be human, clawed and jagged, and in the center of the circle, etched into the snow in deep grooves, were words, "Next year." The Richardson family fled Maplewood that morning, abandoning the house to the cold, silent town. Neighbors later reported seeing the house from afar, lights flickering despite no electricity, shadows moving behind curtains where no one lived. The authorities investigated, but found nothing. No evidence of break-in, no signs of forced entry, and the box had vanished. The story could have ended there, as a single family's brush with terror. But years later in December, similar incidents started cropping up in Maplewood. Other families reported hearing whispers, seeing grotesque faces at their windows and finding strange symbols etched into their doors and snow-covered lawns. Each case shared the same hallmark, a mysterious box appearing at the threshold, and always, always, the footprints surrounding the house with the ominous message in the snow, "Next year." Some say the entity that haunted Maplewood is drawn to families, feeding on their fear and despair, leaving behind relics of its presence as a warning. Others claim it's the spirit of a forgotten child, or a malevolent old-world curse tied to the Christmas season when the line between joy and terror is thinnest. The locals no longer decorate their homes as elaborately, no longer leave their doors unattended. And every year, as snow begins to fall in Maplewood, people remember the Richardsons and the horrors they endured. They whisper to their children to be careful, to listen closely for the faint jingle of a bell in the wind. Because once it starts, The shadows will come, and the footprints will follow. By the time the sun rises, nothing appears abnormal. The snow glitters, the streets look perfect, and the holiday cheer seems untouched. But those who have witnessed it know better. The terror of that Christmas is patient, watching, waiting for the next family to hear the whispers, to see the face at the window, to open the box and find that Christmas cheer can be deadly. No one knows where it comes from. No one knows why it chooses its victims. But one thing is certain, in Maplewood, Christmas is never truly safe. And sometimes the smallest things, a jingle, a doll, a footprint in the snow, can mean the difference between a joyful holiday and a nightmare that lasts a lifetime. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where the streets were lined with snow-covered evergreens and houses twinkled with holiday lights. Most people were bustling with last-minute preparations, wrapping presents, baking cookies, or visiting family. But for the Colemans, the holiday had always carried a quiet tension. Sarah Coleman had been divorced for 5 years, raising her 9-year-old son, Danny, alone. Her ex-husband, Mark, had vanished from her life shortly after the divorce, leaving only sporadic, tense visits and vague threats of custody battles. That year, she wanted Christmas to be simple, safe, and joyful for Danny. No drama, no surprises. Yet, from the moment she woke that morning, something felt off. The air in the house was too still, the quiet too heavy. Danny had been unusually subdued, staring at the window, pressing his small face against the cold glass, whispering about shadows outside. "I don't like the snow tonight, Mom," he said, voice barely audible. "It looks wrong." Sarah forced a smile. "It's just the Christmas lights reflecting, sweetie. Nothing to worry about." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake a prickling sense of unease. The snow outside wasn't just falling. It seemed to be swirling, moving in unnatural patterns, almost like it was alive. She shrugged it off, blaming her imagination and exhaustion from the week's preparations. As night fell, Sarah and Danny settled into their usual routine. They decorated the tree with the ornaments they'd collected over the years, each one a memory of birthdays, holidays, and family vacations. Danny insisted on placing the star himself, and Sarah watched as he climbed on the small stool, wobbling dangerously. She reached out to steady him, but paused, feeling a sudden, inexplicable chill crawl down her spine. For a moment, she swore she saw a dark figure standing just outside the frosted window, watching them. When she blinked, it was gone. Dinner was quiet. Danny ate slowly, picking at his mashed potatoes and turkey, his eyes darting to the window every few minutes. Sarah tried to engage him in conversation, asking about school and friends, but he only muttered brief answers. Something about his behavior felt alien, as if the cheerful child she knew had been replaced by someone or something else. After dinner, they exchanged gifts. Danny unwrapped a model train set he had been dreaming of all year. He smiled, genuinely this time, and for a moment Sarah felt the warmth of a normal Christmas. But then Danny's smile twisted just slightly. Too wide, too forced, and he whispered under his breath, "It's time for the game." Sarah froze. "What game, Danny?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The one where we hide," he said. His tone was eerie, far beyond a child's usual mischief. "And find who doesn't belong." Sarah laughed nervously, assuming he was talking about some imagined play, but the words lodged in her chest like ice. She tried to brush it off and suggested they watch a Christmas movie, but Danny didn't respond. He was already running to the basement, the train set forgotten. When she followed, she noticed the basement door was already cracked open, though she was certain she had locked it. The room smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Danny wasn't at the bottom of the stairs, as she expected. Instead, she saw him standing in the far corner, staring at the shadows that danced across the walls, illuminated by the flickering Christmas lights she had strung above. "Danny?" she called, her voice shaking. "What are you doing down here?" He turned slowly, and for a brief moment, she couldn't recognize him. His eyes were dark, almost black, and the small grin on his face made her stomach twist. "It's time, Mom," he said. "Time to see who's naughty." Sarah took a step back. "Danny, this isn't funny." But it wasn't a joke. That night, the strange occurrences escalated. The Christmas lights began flickering wildly, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. The ornaments on the tree swayed, though there was no breeze. Sarah tried to reach for the fuse box to cut the power, but the lights themselves seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Danny, or whatever was inhabiting him, moved with unnatural speed, darting between the shadows, whispering words she couldn't fully comprehend. In the living room, Sarah noticed that the presence under the tree had changed. Wrapping paper was torn, boxes distorted, and some gifts that she didn't remember buying had appeared. She picked up a small, hand-carved figure of a man, an old-fashioned nutcracker, but as she held it, the wood seemed to shift in her hands, forming a snarling, twisted face. The room temperature plummeted, and her breath became visible in the freezing air. Danny's voice came from behind her. "They're here, Mom. They're always here. Watching." She spun around, but the basement stairs were empty. Then the shadows began moving on their own, stretching and twisting like dark fingers reaching toward her. Sarah screamed and ran upstairs, slamming the door behind her, but when she looked through the peephole, the hallway appeared impossibly long, stretching into darkness that shouldn't exist in her small house. The phone was dead. No dial tone, no buzzing. Just silence. Sarah tried the door to leave, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had changed, locking her in. And then she heard it. A soft, scraping sound coming from the attic. She knew Danny was upstairs. He had to be. But the sound wasn't him. It was something else, something that moved with patience and malice. Against every instinct screaming at her to run, she climbed the attic stairs. The air grew heavier with each step, smelling of old pine, rust, and something worse, like decay. When she reached the top, the attic was empty. No Danny, no boxes, nothing but shadows pooling in the corners. And then she saw them, small footprints in the dust, tiny but elongated like a child's and something else's combined. They led to the window. Outside, the snow was moving in spirals again, forming shapes that resembled screaming faces. "Mom?" Danny's voice came from behind her, soft now, almost pleading. But when she turned, it wasn't Danny. It was a dark silhouette, taller than him, with long, spindly limbs and a grin that stretched impossibly wide. The real Danny appeared behind it, eyes wide with fear. "Mom, don't let it take me." The creature lunged. Sarah grabbed Danny and bolted down the stairs. The house seemed to twist around them, hallways elongating, doors appearing where there shouldn't be any. She ran into the kitchen, grabbed a heavy skillet and swung at the shadow. It passed through the figure, but a shriek echoed through the house, loud enough to make her ears ring. They ran to the front door, and for a moment hope surged, until the lock turned on its own. They were trapped. The shadow was everywhere now, crawling along walls, dripping from the ceiling, pooling on the floor. Danny clung to her, shaking. "Mom, remember the light," he whispered. "The light, it hates it." Desperate, Sarah grabbed the nearest string of Christmas lights and ripped them from the tree. She waved them, letting the bulbs glow bright in the darkness. The shadow recoiled, hissing, the air vibrating with its rage. It screamed, a sound that was neither human nor animal, and then it vanished, slipping into the cracks of the house like smoke. The dawn came slowly. When Sarah finally dared to look outside, the snow had stopped. The town seemed normal again. There was no sign of the spiraling patterns, no twisted shadows, nothing but an ordinary winter morning. Danny was asleep on the living room floor, safe, or so it seemed. But as Sarah checked the basement, she found the train set she had bought Danny. The tracks had been rearranged overnight into a perfect spiral. At the center sat the small, hand-carved nutcracker from before. Its face had changed. Now it grinned with razor-sharp teeth, tiny black eyes glinting with malice. And when Sarah picked it up, she swore she could hear a whisper in the air, "See you next year." Christmas passed quietly after that, but Sarah never forgot the shadows or the way Danny's voice had changed. That winter, she installed new locks, replaced doors, and even moved some of the furniture. But no matter what she did, she always felt watched. Every snowfall brought a chill that wasn't from the cold, and every Christmas light flicker made her heart pound with a memory she couldn't escape. Years later, when Danny was a teenager, he would sometimes sit by the window for hours, staring at the snow in silence. Sarah never asked why. She already knew. The shadows had returned every Christmas since that night, lurking just beyond the glow of the lights, waiting for the moment when the spiral would be complete. And every year, without fail, something in the air whispered, "Time for the game." Story the end. The snow fell hard that Christmas Eve in upstate New York, blanketing the small town of Millfield in a thick, silent white. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car that left greasy tracks in the snow. Most people were indoors, finishing last-minute preparations for Christmas morning. But the Miller family wasn't feeling the festive spirit that year. Their father, Tom Miller, had recently lost his job at the local factory, and the holiday felt heavy, hollow. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels oppressive, not peaceful. Tom's wife, Karen, tried to keep things normal for their children, Emily, 10, and Jake, 7. She strung up lights and hung stockings, but her laughter didn't reach her eyes. Emily sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine, while Jake built a crooked block tower on the carpet. Every now and then, Karen would glance out the window at the darkened yard, and something about the shadows under the old oak tree made her uneasy. Around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang. Tom frowned. Nobody was supposed to be visiting tonight. He pulled on his coat and opened the door to find a man in a Santa suit. It wasn't jolly, more off. The fabric was worn and fraying, and his beard looked fake, uneven, almost like it had been cut with scissors. "Merry Christmas," the man said, voice too loud, too harsh. He handed Tom a small wrapped package. "A gift for your children, just for tonight." Tom frowned. Thanks, but we weren't expecting anyone." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No problem. Just keep the tradition alive." He handed over the box and left without another word, disappearing into the snow. Tom closed the door, feeling a shiver creep up his spine. The children squealed when they saw the gift. It was a large wooden box, hand-carved with intricate patterns. They brought it to the living room, and as they unwrapped it, a strange smell wafted out, like cedar and something metallic, almost like blood. Inside was a small, intricately carved music box with a winding key and a painted scene of a snowy village. Karen tried to force a smile. "Turn it on," Emily said, her eyes wide. Tom wound the key and a haunting melody started to play. At first it was charming, but soon the notes warped, slowing unnaturally, stretching and bending until the music sounded like it was coming from underwater. The room grew cold, and the flames in the fireplace flickered violently. Emily and Jake shivered. "Dad, it's weird," Jake said, clutching his blanket. Tom reached to turn the music box off, but it wouldn't stop. The key wouldn't turn back, and the lid seemed to resist closing. Then, faintly at first, a whispering started. Soft, almost imperceptible, like dozens of voices speaking at once. The whispers grew louder, and Karen felt her stomach knot. "Tom, maybe we should," she started, but the whispers drowned out her voice. Emily pointed at the window. "Someone's out there." Karen turned to look. Standing under the oak tree was a figure. At first, she thought it was a man in a Santa suit, like the one who had delivered the box. But this figure didn't move like a person. Its arms were too long, dragging along the snow, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The figure raised one hand, and in the dim light, she saw that its fingers were thin and bony, tipped with black nails. Tom tried to call 911, but his phone had no signal. The whispers inside the house became a chant, words forming in the corners of Karen's mind. "Open. Let us in. We are here." The music box kept playing, each note stretching painfully, each sound twisting reality. The children screamed when the windows fogged over, frost spreading rapidly from the edges as though something cold and alive was seeping through. Karen grabbed Emily and Jake, trying to shield them, but the air grew heavy and breathing became a chore. Then the front door rattled violently. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass, tall, impossibly thin, reaching for the handle. Tom tried to hold the door shut, but the handle rattled with a force that felt inhuman. The whispers became screaming. Suddenly, the music box stopped. Silence slammed into the room, deafening in its intensity. The shadow at the door froze, and the wind outside died. Then, softly, the door opened on its own, creaking slowly. Tom instinctively stepped in front of the children, ready to protect them, but what came through wasn't human. It was the man from earlier, but distorted, grotesque. His beard hung in chunks, eyes hollow, and his mouth stretched too wide when he smiled. Behind him, more figures emerged from the snow, thin, elongated, twisted, Santa-like figures, their faces melted, featureless. They moved like shadows sliding across the floor. Karen screamed and tried to grab the children, but they were drawn toward the box, which had started spinning on its own, the painted village inside coming to life. Smoke rose from the tiny chimneys, and inside the figures were moving, playing, laughing, but with a sinister undertone. Emily and Jake stopped screaming, mesmerized. Their eyes glazed over. Tom lunged for them, but his hands passed through the children as if they were made of smoke. The whispers returned, now clearly saying, "Join us, forever." Karen grabbed the music box, throwing it into the fireplace. Flames roared up, the wood carving twisting and writhing like it was alive. The fire exploded with a deafening crack, and the figures screamed. A sound so inhuman it made Karen drop to her knees, ears ringing. When she looked up, the house was empty. The music box was gone, the snow outside undisturbed, no footprints, no figures. The children were gone too. Just the faint smell of cedar and iron lingered in the air. Tom ran outside, calling their names. Nothing. The neighbors' houses were dark, silent. The town seemed abandoned. The next morning, the police found the Miller house empty. No sign of a break-in, no evidence that anyone had ever been there besides the empty furniture. The only clue was a single snow-dusted music box sitting on the doorstep, the painted village spinning slowly, but when anyone tried to pick it up, the paint had warped, showing scenes of people standing frozen in terror inside the tiny houses. Months passed. The Miller family was never seen again. The police closed the case, assuming a family dispute or foul play, but neighbors swore they saw shadows moving near the house on Christmas Eve each year. Every year, a package would appear on the doorstep, a hand-carved box, a faint smell of cedar and iron, and the same warped, haunting melody playing inside. No one who looked inside ever came out the same. Some say it's the spirit of Christmas, taking the lonely and the despairing, twisting joy into horror. Others claim the figures are remnants of the man who delivered the first box, forever trapped in some otherworldly version of Santa Claus, bringing victims to a wintry nightmare. No one knows why the Miller family was chosen. Some say it was the weight of sorrow, the heaviness of despair that made them vulnerable. Others say it's random, and the music box simply seeks a home to open itself. Every year in Millfield, people lock their doors and windows. But every Christmas Eve, some swear they hear a faint, warped melody drifting through the air like a snowstorm carrying whispers that promise joy but deliver something far darker. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Pine Brook, Pennsylvania, a town where the streets were lined with snow-dusted pines, and every house glittered with lights. The air was sharp and cold, and a thick blanket of snow muffled every sound except for the occasional jingle of a bell from a passing car. For the Walters family, it should have been a perfect night. Lydia Walters and her husband Mark were bustling around the house finishing preparations for Christmas dinner. Their two children, 12-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Ben, were sprawled in front of the fireplace, carefully arranging their stockings and whispering excitedly about what Santa might bring. The smell of roast turkey and cinnamon filled the house, and for a moment, everything felt cozy and safe. But Pine Brook was not as quiet as it seemed. Outside, the snowstorm had picked up, and the wind carried with it a strange, almost human sound, like a low, mournful sigh that drifted through the trees. Mark had noticed it first, pausing while he hung a wreath on the front door. "Lydia, do you hear that?" he asked. She shook her head, brushing his concern off. "It's just the wind. Don't start worrying on Christmas Eve." Still, the sound lingered in his mind, a whispering that seemed to ebb and flow with the gusts of the storm. Later that evening, after dinner, the family settled in to watch a Christmas movie. The power flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. The children laughed nervously, thinking it was part of the adventure, while Lydia lit candles around the living room. Mark checked the circuit breaker, but everything appeared normal. That's when the first knock came. Soft at first, almost tentative, at the front door. "Who could that be?" Sophie asked, her voice small. Mark approached the door cautiously. "Probably a neighbor," he muttered. Though his voice carried a tremor he tried to hide. He opened the door, revealing nothing but the heavy snow and a swirling blizzard. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Shrugging, he closed the door and locked it. The house settled back into silence, except for the wind, which now seemed to carry voices, soft, broken, like children whispering in the snow. By midnight, the storm had grown worse. The snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, and the wind howled against the house like a living thing. Sophie and Ben were tucked into bed, but Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the darkness. Then came the sound that made her blood run cold, the faint scraping of something being dragged across the porch. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I think someone's outside." Mark grabbed a flashlight and crept to the front door. The beam of light cut through the snow, illuminating nothing but the blizzard. And yet, he could see faint, deep scratches on the porch steps, as though something had been clawing its way closer. "Lydia, get the kids," he said, his calm demeanor slipping. The family huddled together in the living room, candles casting flickering shadows across the walls. The scraping continued, relentless now, circling the house. At one point, it paused, then shifted, moving up the side of the house. Lydia pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was everywhere, impossible to ignore. Then, a whisper, so soft it was barely audible over the storm. "Let me in." Mark shone the flashlight toward the living room window. The beam caught a figure, hunched and dark, staring at them through the glass. Its face was obscured by a hood, but the eyes, two glinting black voids, seemed to pierce through the room. Mark tried to calm everyone. "It's probably just a prank, someone outside. Don't worry." But the figure didn't leave. It moved with a deliberate slowness, dragging something behind it. When the flashlight caught the object, Lydia's stomach lurched. It was a crude doll, tied up with rope, its head broken and eyes missing. The figure lifted it, shaking it lightly, and whispered again, "You forgot me?" The family screamed. Mark grabbed a heavy lamp and approached the window, but the figure vanished, leaving only the snow swirling in the wind. No one slept that night. Every sound, every shadow was a threat. When the storm finally cleared, the family inspected the yard. Deep, uneven footprints led from the edge of the forest to the house, then stopped abruptly at the porch. The tracks were not human. They were long, misshapen, with deep gouges that looked like claws. Over the next few days, strange things continued. Gifts were found ripped open, replaced with objects that made no sense. Small, broken toys, twisted bits of metal, shards of glass. The children complained of whispers in their rooms, calling their names, laughing softly when the parents rushed in to check. One evening, a neighbor came by, concerned. "You know, Lydia, people say the old Miller place in the woods is cursed. They say the man who lived there died on Christmas Eve years ago, alone. No one found him for days. Some say he still wanders on snowy nights, looking for a family to visit." Lydia shivered. She wanted to laugh, but something deep in her gut told her that wasn't a story. It was a warning. Christmas night arrived again, but the storm had returned, heavier than ever. The family huddled together, hoping it would pass without incident. The wind rattled the windows, carrying with it that same low, mournful sigh. Then came the knocks, louder and more insistent this time, echoing through the house. Mark checked the front door. The flashlight beam revealed nothing. Then, as he turned, the beam caught movement behind the Christmas tree. The figure, hooded, taller than the man it seemed to be, dragging that same broken doll across the floor. Lydia screamed, grabbing the children, but the figure moved impossibly fast. It lunged, its hands cold as ice, and disappeared, leaving behind a scent of decay and a whisper that lingered in the air. Next year. After that night, the family moved away from Pine Brook. They never spoke of what happened to anyone outside of themselves. But every Christmas, without fail, the nightmares returned. Shadows in windows, whispers in the wind, the scratching of claws on wooden floors. Sophie swore she could hear soft singing of twisted Christmas carols. Ben cried at the sound of footsteps in empty hallways. And Lydia and Mark stayed awake, staring at the doors and windows, terrified to blink. Years later, when Sophie was old enough to understand, she asked her mother why the figure had visited them. Lydia had no answer, only a shiver, and the memory of the pale, hollow eyes staring through the snow. The legend of the Miller Man never left the town of Pine Brook, and the family never celebrated another Christmas without fear that he might return, dragging broken toys and whispering their names in the storm. Even now, decades later, they remember that night with perfect clarity. Every snowfall, every blizzard carries the memory of that figure and the warning it left behind. Some grudges, some memories do not die, and some visitors never leave. Story. The end. The wind was relentless that December evening, whipping snow across the small Midwestern town of Cedar Hollow. Christmas lights flickered on the houses lining Main Street, struggling against the gusts. The warmth of holiday cheer inside homes contrasted sharply with the icy desolation outside. But for the Miller family, the season had lost its glow. Sarah Miller sat on the couch, a mug of lukewarm cocoa in her hands, staring at the twinkling tree in the corner of the living room. It had been a rough year. Her husband, Tom, had lost his job at the factory in August, and their savings were almost gone. Their 10-year-old son, Jamie, had been quieter than usual, his excitement for Christmas dimmed by the tension at home. Sarah tried to focus on the lights and the ornaments, the laughter they usually brought, but all she felt was a deep, gnawing unease. Tom finally came in from clearing the driveway, his face red from the cold. "It's worse than last year," he muttered, brushing snow off his coat. "Looks like we might get another foot tonight." "I've stocked up on groceries," Sarah said softly, trying to sound cheerful. "We'll be fine." Tom nodded. But there was a distant look in his eyes. "Yeah, sure." That night, the snowstorm hit its peak. The wind howled like a chorus of unseen voices, rattling the windows. Jamie lay in his bed, listening to the storm, when he thought he heard something else. A scratching at the back door. He told himself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch hitting the siding, but the sound persisted. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the living room window. Through the frosted glass, he saw it, a shadowy figure standing just beyond the snowdrifts. It was tall, unnaturally still, and its face was obscured by the hood of a tattered coat. Jamie's stomach churned. He blinked, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. Heart pounding, he crept back to his bed, convincing himself he was imagining things. Around midnight, Sarah awoke to the sound of the front door creaking. She froze, clutching the blanket. Tom was snoring beside her, oblivious. The door didn't slam or shake. It just opened, a slow, deliberate groan. Sarah's first thought was that the wind had forced it open, but she had locked it before bed. Her breath caught as she slipped from the bed and peered through the living room doorway. The room was empty. The tree's lights flickered against the walls, casting long, distorted shadows. But then she saw the footprints, muddy, long, and impossibly thin, trailing from the front door toward the tree. Her pulse raced, and she fumbled for her phone, realizing it was dead. She checked the outlets. Dead. Every light, every device, dead. A low thump echoed from the basement. Sarah's mind screamed at her to stay put, to call the police, to run, but something rooted her to the spot. The thump came again, louder this time, like heavy footsteps on the stairs. "Tom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No answer. She grabbed the nearest object, a metal fireplace poker, and edged toward the basement door. Each step was careful, deliberate. The door was slightly ajar, a shadow spilling out from the darkness below. She took a deep breath and pushed it open. The basement was empty, cold, and damp, but the air felt wrong, stale, almost rancid. Sarah's eyes adjusted, and she noticed something etched into the concrete floor. Strange symbols, jagged lines arranged in a circle. They weren't like anything she'd ever seen. A faint odor of something metallic, blood, hung in the air. Suddenly, a whisper grazed her ear. "Why are you awake?" Sarah spun around. No one was there. Panic surged. She ran upstairs, fumbling for the door, when she saw him. At the end of the hallway, where the shadows pooled unnaturally, stood the figure from earlier. Its face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth twisted into a smile that was all wrong, too wide, too cruel. "Tom!" Sarah screamed, but the figure only tilted its head. It moved toward her without a sound, floating rather than walking. She stumbled backward, tripping over the rug, and fell against the couch. The figure stopped, leaning closer, and she saw the faint outline of writing across its chest. Something that seemed to writhe as she watched, letters that rearranged themselves as if alive. Jamie screamed from his room, and the figure froze, snapping its attention toward the child. It lurched, unnaturally fast, toward the stairs leading to Jamie's room. Sarah scrambled after it, swinging the poker wildly. The figure absorbed the swing, moving through her like mist. "Leave him alone," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. She lunged forward, and suddenly the figure recoiled, letting out a shriek that rattled the windows. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment the shadow vanished. Sarah grabbed Jamie, who was crying uncontrollably, and bolted for the door, but the storm outside had worsened. Snow piled against the door, creating a barrier that was impossible to push through. The temperature inside plummeted, her breath visible in the freezing air. Then she saw him, Tom, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, his eyes wide, unblinking, staring at nothing. "It's coming," he whispered. "It's in the house." Sarah's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" But Tom didn't answer. He simply turned toward the hallway, his movements jerky, unnatural. From the shadows, the figure emerged again, this time dragging something, a bundle covered in a tattered red cloth. Sarah realized with horror that it was the family cat, Muffin, her body limp and lifeless. Rage and terror collided in her chest. "No," she screamed, lunging at the figure. It recoiled, and this time she felt a cold, icy hand grasp hers. She pulled instinctively, trying to escape, but the force was overwhelming, dragging her backward into the darkness. Jamie cried out, "Mom, Mom!" and she felt herself being torn apart from him. She clawed at the floor, at the walls, anything to stay close, but the figure had her. Its face loomed inches from hers, eyes burning with something ancient and malevolent. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. Sarah collapsed to the floor, gasping, shivering violently. The house was silent. The storm outside had quieted, leaving an eerie calm. Tom and Jamie were nowhere to be seen. She searched frantically, calling their names, but it was as if the house itself had swallowed them. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed meaningless. When dawn finally broke, neighbors arrived, having braved the storm. They found the Miller house open, doors swinging in the cold morning air. Inside, the tree was still lit, ornaments untouched, but there were no signs of life. No Sarah, no Tom, no Jamie. Only the strange symbols remained etched into the basement floor, faintly glowing in the morning light. Authorities were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no footprints leading away from the house except for the families. The house was eventually boarded up, left to decay, but locals whispered about the Miller disappearance for years. Children claimed they saw shadowy figures in the windows during December nights, always hovering near the tree, always watching. 1 year later, during a particularly harsh snowstorm, a man driving past the abandoned Miller house swore he saw a family inside the living room, wrapped in blankets, staring silently at the tree. Their faces were pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes seemed to follow him as he passed. He swore he heard the faintest whisper as he drove away. "Merry Christmas." Every year since that night, Cedar Hollow residents reported strange occurrences during December. Lights flickering in empty houses, shadows moving against the wind, and the sensation of being watched. Some said it was the spirit of the Millers, trapped in their home by whatever had claimed them. Others whispered darker truths, that the creature that haunted the Millers had only moved on to feed again, and that every Christmas it returned to remind the town that not all shadows were harmless, and not every holiday cheer was pure. Families installed new locks, extra security cameras, and alarms, but it didn't matter. The presence was patient, waiting, watching. Snowstorms became a warning, not a wonder. Children were warned to stay inside, to not listen for whispers from the yard, and never ever to wander near the Miller house after dark. Decades passed, yet the story persisted. Parents told it to scare misbehaving children, but the warnings were real, terrifyingly real. And each Christmas, when the wind howls through Cedar Hollow and the snow blinds the streets, those who have lived through it swear they see the shadow of a tall figure standing just beyond the drifted snow, waiting for the next family to come home. Story, the end. The snow had been falling steadily all evening, blanketing the small town of Millersville in a soft white hush that made everything feel like a postcard. The streets were quiet except for the occasional crunch of tires on the ice, and the glow of Christmas lights in the windows cast a warm, cheerful aura over the houses. It should have been a perfect holiday evening, but something about it felt off. That winter, the town had experienced an unusual cold snap, the kind that made the air feel brittle, as though one wrong move could shatter it. In one particular house at the end of Pine Street, the Thompson family was preparing for Christmas Eve. James Thompson, a 42-year-old construction worker, had spent the morning putting up a new tree in the living room. His wife, Linda, had been baking cookies with their two children, Emma, aged 10, and little Tommy, aged 6. Everything looked normal. The tree twinkled with multicolored lights, stockings hung neatly over the fireplace, and a plate of cookies sat untouched on the counter. But just as the family settled in to begin opening presents, the lights flickered and went out, leaving the room illuminated only by the tree's soft glow. Probably just a power surge, James muttered, reaching for his phone to check the time. But the screen showed no signal, not even the usual little bar at the top. Linda frowned. The whole block must be out, she said. Maybe the storm got the lines. James put on his coat and stepped outside to see if the neighbors had power. Snow crunched under his boots as he made his way to the front yard. That's when he noticed the strange footprints in the fresh snow. They were oddly spaced and didn't match any boots he had seen. Long, deep, and spaced far apart, like someone, or something, was walking on tiptoe. They led from the edge of the woods that bordered the property straight toward the house, stopping abruptly at the gate. Shaking his head, James convinced himself it was probably just a deer or some prankster from town. The idea of someone or something lurking in the dark at Christmas seemed absurd. By the time he returned inside, the house had grown eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that sets your teeth on edge. Emma and Tommy were still playing with the cookie dough, but Linda had gone to check the fuse box in the basement. That's when the first sound came, a slow, deliberate knock on the front door. James froze. "Linda?" he called out, but there was no answer. The knocking came again, louder this time, and then a low, rasping whisper from just outside. "James?" He bolted to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. Just the snow swirling in the streetlight, glinting like broken glass. Trying to shake off the chill creeping down his spine, he opened the door cautiously. Nothing. Just the footprints leading back to the woods. He slammed the door and locked it, heart hammering. The family tried to ignore it, convincing themselves it was some prank or an animal. But as the evening progressed, strange things escalated. The tree lights began flickering in strange patterns, almost like a code. Presents under the tree shifted positions when no one was looking. Emma swore she saw a shadow moving across the room when she went to check the cookies. And then Tommy's favorite stuffed reindeer disappeared. "Maybe it's Santa?" he asked, but his voice carried an edge of fear. No one laughed. Not really. By midnight, the snowstorm had grown violent. Wind howled around the house, rattling the windows, and James was certain he heard footsteps crunching on the roof. The power returned briefly, then cut out again. The whispering voices came in the darkness now, echoing from every corner. James. Linda. Children. Linda, trying to stay calm, suggested they all go to the basement to ride out the storm. The basement was their safe place, a small, windowless room with concrete walls and a heavy door. They packed flashlights, blankets, and some food, descending the narrow stairs one by one. But as James reached the bottom, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The walls were no longer bare. There were words etched into the concrete, deep gouges that hadn't been there before. "You can't hide." He ran his hand over them. The scratches were fresh, and the faint smell of iron lingered in the air. Tommy whimpered and clutched his mother's hand, refusing to look. Linda tried to comfort him, but her voice shook. James grabbed a flashlight and shone it around, and that's when he saw them. Faces pressed against the basement door window, pale, almost translucent, staring at them with hollow eyes. He banged on the door. "Who's there? What do you want?" But the faces didn't move. They just stared. And then the whispering began again, louder this time, overlapping into a cacophony of voices calling their names. James, desperate, grabbed a hammer from the tool bench and ran to the door. He swung it at the lock, but it held firm. He tried the windows. Nothing. The basement seemed to shrink with every passing minute, the air growing colder, almost biting. Emma clung to him, her eyes wide, tears freezing on her cheeks. Then came the scratching. From the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, everywhere. Something was trying to get in, something heavy, relentless, patient. And then the whispering shifted. "Look behind you." James spun around. Nothing. The flashlight beam caught a shadow moving across the far corner of the basement. He called out, but the shadow didn't respond. Instead, it grew, stretching into a dark figure taller than any human. Its head cocked unnaturally, eyes glowing faintly red. It stepped forward, and the temperature plummeted. James felt his breath freeze in his lungs. Linda screamed. Tommy cried. Emma clutched her favorite doll, shaking. James tried to swing the hammer again, but it passed through the figure like smoke. And then he realized the shadows weren't just outside, they were inside him. Reflections in the basement walls began to distort, their own faces twisted into grotesque versions, mouths stretching impossibly wide, eyes hollowing out as the whispers became laughter. Time seemed to fracture, minutes stretched into hours. The family huddled together, the dark figure at the edge of the light, watching. And then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The basement door was unlocked, the lights back on, the storm outside quiet. The snow had stopped falling. The world was still. But the aftermath was worse. The children were changed. Emma refused to talk, muttering to someone no one could see. Tommy wouldn't sleep alone, screaming about the red eyes in the dark. James and Linda couldn't leave the house after nightfall, terrified of what waited outside. And every year, without fail, on Christmas Eve, the whispers returned. Always faint, just at the edge of hearing, calling names, scratching, moving things in the house. Neighbors said it was nothing, just the wind, just the cold, just imagination. But James knew better. He had seen it, felt it, smelled it. The presence that waited, patient and unrelenting, at the edges of their lives. Each Christmas, the snow fell heavier, the shadows lingered longer, and the house became a trap of light and dark, a prison where time and fear had no end. The Thompson family never left Millersville. They never celebrated Christmas the way they used to. Each year, they barricaded themselves inside, lights off, doors locked, praying that the storm would pass without incident. But the shadows, the whispers, the faces at the windows, they always came. They never missed a Christmas. And the longer they stayed, the more James realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't just outside the house, it was inside them, feeding on their fear, waiting for the moment when one of them would finally open the door. And every year, James swore he could hear the faint scraping of claws on the roof, the slow crunch of footsteps in the snow, and the whispering, always whispering, promising that next year, it would come closer. Story the end. It was a frigid December evening in upstate New York. The kind of cold that makes the breath fog in front of your face and freezes the eyelashes into little crystal bars. Snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, turning the small town of Millersfield into a seemingly perfect Christmas postcard. Lights twinkled in every window, wreaths hung on doors, and the smell of pine and cinnamon drifted from homes. But for the Reynolds family, this holiday season was anything but merry. Sarah Reynolds, 32, had been running late all day, juggling last-minute Christmas shopping and work emails. Her husband, Mark, had taken the kids to see the tree lighting downtown, leaving her alone in their sprawling century-old house at the edge of town. It was quiet, too quiet, and the way the snow muffled sound outside made the stillness almost unbearable. Sarah had just hung the last ornament on the tree when she heard it, a faint scratching like nails on wood. At first, she assumed it was just the house settling, but the sound persisted. Slowly, it moved, a deliberate scratching that circled the living room. Her heart began to pound. "Must be the wind," she muttered to herself, though the sound didn't match any ordinary draft or creak. She went to the kitchen to grab a knife, the unease coiling in her stomach. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed the front door, which she was certain she had locked, was slightly ajar. Panic surged through her chest. She never left the door unlocked, especially with the kids out. "Mark?" she called, her voice trembling. Silence answered. She pulled the door open fully and looked down the long driveway. The snow was pristine, except for one set of footprints leading away from the house into the woods. They weren't Mark's, they were much smaller, and closer together than a normal adult's stride. The sound of scratching returned, louder now, coming from the basement. The house had always had a basement, but it was unfinished and filled with old furniture, boxes, and winter debris. She hated going down there alone, but something about the noise demanded her attention. Sarah grabbed a flashlight and descended the creaking steps, each one groaning under her weight. The scratching stopped as soon as she reached the bottom. The basement was dark and cold, and the beam from her flashlight caught nothing unusual, until she saw the words written across the far wall in what looked like soot or dirt. "I see you." Her stomach dropped. She turned to run, but the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut on its own, and she was plunged into darkness. Panic clawed at her throat. The scratching started again, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Sarah fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. The house was isolated, surrounded by dense woods, and with the storm outside, no one would hear her screams. Upstairs, Mark had noticed the children acting strangely. His 6-year-old Lily kept staring at the window, whispering to someone Sarah couldn't see. His 8-year-old Ben had been carrying around a small doll he insisted was his friend. The doll, Mark noticed, had tiny scratches across its porcelain face, as if someone had clawed it. Mark tried to comfort them, telling them it was cold and they were imagining things. But the kids' behavior grew more unsettling. At one point, Lily said, "He wants you to come down," and Ben muttered, "He lives under the stairs. He's hungry." Mark assumed it was childish imagination, fueled by Christmas excitement, but an instinctive fear had settled in his chest. Back in the basement, Sarah's flashlight flickered and then went out, leaving her in total darkness. The growl grew louder, circling her. She felt a cold, bony hand brush against her shoulder. She spun around, swinging the knife wildly, but there was nothing, only the sense of being watched. Her mind raced. Burglars? Intruder? But why leave the door unlocked? Why right on the wall? Upstairs, the children began screaming. Mark rushed to the stairs, but when he reached the landing, the house went eerily silent. The snowstorm outside was the only sound, but it carried no wind. He ran to the basement door, yanking it open. It led to empty steps, dark, silent, no sign of Sarah. "Mommy!" Lily screamed from her room, but when he turned back, the door to her room was closed, locked from the inside. He pried it open and found the room empty, except for the doll sitting upright in the middle of the floor. Its tiny eyes seemed to glint in the dim light. The phone rang, suddenly, loud and shrill, though no one had been near it. Mark answered. A low, whispering voice said, "You can't take her away from me. She's mine." The line went dead. Mark bolted outside through the snow, screaming for Sarah, but the footprints led into the woods, vanishing near a frozen creek. The doll, he noticed, was no longer in the living room. It was now sitting on the porch, staring at him. Hours passed. The police arrived, but the snowstorm and isolation hampered their search. They found no trace of Sarah. The children, now hysterical, clutched each other and whispered about a shadowed figure that lived under the stairs. Even in the safety of the police station, they refused to speak, terrified of him coming for them. Days turned into weeks. The house remained empty, and neighbors reported hearing strange noises, footsteps, scratching, whispering voices, especially at night. The children were sent to live with relatives far away, but they never spoke of the incident again, except in nightmares. A year later, Mark returned to the house, hoping to salvage belongings and memories. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached the porch. The front door, which he had securely locked before leaving, was ajar. Inside, the Christmas tree stood, decorations dusty but perfectly in place. The doll sat on the middle stair, smiling. On the basement wall, written faintly in frost from the cold, were new words. "You came back." Mark ran, never returning. The house was abandoned after that, a grim monument to a holiday gone horribly wrong. Locals whispered about the Reynolds house, claiming the spirit or entity claimed its own every Christmas, feeding on fear, growing stronger with every victim. Every winter, when the first snow fell, neighbors reported hearing scratching, soft at first, then loud, circling the house. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone would see a small figure in the window, watching, waiting, as if inviting them in. Years later, the house was bought by a new family, unaware of its dark history. The first Christmas night, the mother woke to the sound of scratching. Her husband was away, and the children slept peacefully, or so it seemed. She followed the sound to the basement, flashlight trembling in her hand. As she descended the stairs, the words were there, etched freshly into the wall. "Welcome home." Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in a small town in upstate New York, the kind of town where the streets were lined with frosted pines and the occasional wreath hung crookedly on a door, giving a sense of quaint holiday cheer. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the streets in white and muffling the usual hum of life. The Thompson family was finishing their last-minute preparations. The tree was lit, presents wrapped, and the smell of cinnamon and pine filled the living room. Mark Thompson, a local electrician, was adjusting the lights on the house outside, humming a Christmas carol under his breath, while his wife, Lisa, set the final touches on the dinner table. Their two kids, Tommy and Ellie, were upstairs, arguing over which Christmas movie they would watch first. Everything seemed normal, too normal. Mark noticed a car slowly cruising past their house, its headlights dim and its movements oddly cautious. He waved, expecting the driver to wave back, but the car continued slowly down the road, pausing at the next house, then moving on. Strange, but not alarming. He went back inside, shrugging it off. By 10 p.m., the snow had piled high, and the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. Lisa, preparing the last of the mashed potatoes, noticed the front door was slightly ajar. She swore she had locked it. Mark was already upstairs, checking on the kids, and Lisa was certain he hadn't been outside after she had secured the door. She locked it again, but a chill ran down her spine. They sat down to eat, the sound of the wind outside filling the silence. Ellie was the first to break it. "Mom, I think someone's outside." Lisa laughed nervously. "Honey, it's just the wind. Go back to your movie." But Ellie shook her head. "No, really. I saw someone in the yard." Mark frowned. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the yard was empty. No footprints, no cars, nothing except the cold wind. But then he saw it, a single handprint on the frosted window of the living room. It was smeared as if someone had pressed against the glass and then tried to wipe it away. Mark's heart thumped. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a prank. But the house was supposed to be quiet tonight. He returned inside, trying to laugh it off. "Probably just a neighbor's kid," he said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his unease. By midnight, the wind had become a howling storm. The power flickered, and Mark, flashlight in hand, went to check the breaker box. As he descended into the basement, he heard it, a faint whisper. He froze, straining his ears. The whispering continued, incoherent but urgent, coming from the living room. Mark's stomach twisted. He crept up the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. In the living room, he found the tree lights flickering violently. The ornaments had been moved, some shattered on the floor, though the kids were upstairs. And there, standing at the window, was a figure. Dark, hunched, indistinct, but clearly human. The figure's head jerked toward him, and it moved quickly out of sight before he could reach it. Mark's hand went to the phone, but there was no dial tone. The storm had knocked out the lines. Lisa came running down, alarmed by the shouting. "Mark? What is it?" "There's someone," he stammered. Someone was in the living room. They called the neighbors, but everyone's phones were dead. They considered leaving, but the snowstorm had made the roads impassable. Trapped in their own home, fear set in. Around 1 a.m., the kids woke up screaming. Tommy claimed he had seen someone peering in through his bedroom window. Mark and Lisa checked again, but the snow had covered any footprints. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Then the banging started. It began on the roof, heavy, deliberate. At first, Mark thought it was the wind, but the rhythm was too intentional, too steady to be natural. The banging moved to the windows, then the doors. The family huddled together in the living room, the lights flickering, candles casting trembling shadows on the walls. Suddenly the power came back on. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. Outside, by the driveway, they saw something that made them all freeze. Footprints, large, deeply pressed into the snow, circled the house. But there was something unnerving. Some of the prints were backward, as if someone was walking in reverse. Mark grabbed the shotgun he kept in the hall. Lisa clutched the kids. The front door rattled violently. Then the storm seemed to amplify their terror, howling through the cracks and corners of the house. And then quiet, too quiet. Mark opened the door cautiously, peering into the snow-covered yard. Nothing. Only the footprints stopping abruptly in the middle of the lawn. He stepped outside, following them, but the snow had already begun to erase the tracks. They decided to lock themselves in the master bedroom. The night dragged on, long and oppressive. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak magnified. Lisa tried to comfort the kids, but her own fear was a weight she could not hide. Just before dawn, they heard the whisper again, closer now, almost inside the room. Tommy cried out, "He's in the house!" Mark grabbed the flashlight and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the bedroom door was slowly closing on its own, and when Mark flung it open, he saw something that would haunt him forever. Ellie's window was wide open, snow swirling into the room, and outside, standing on the roof, was the figure. tall, unnervingly thin, wearing a dark coat that blended with the night. Its face was hidden, but its presence radiated a malevolence that made Mark's blood run cold. Before he could react, it leapt from the roof, disappearing into the trees beyond. The sound of its footsteps on the snow was faint but unmistakable. They stayed huddled together for hours, afraid to move, until the first light of Christmas morning broke through the clouds. Mark and Lisa ventured outside, cautiously. The snow had covered most of the tracks, but some remained near the edge of the forest. A single set of footprints, large, twisted, and fading into the trees. They called the police as soon as the lines worked again. Officers combed the area, but nothing was found. No evidence, no footprints beyond what had already vanished. The rest of Christmas was uneasy. They tried to celebrate, but every shadow, every creak of the old house reminded them of that night. The kids refused to go near the windows, and even the police admitted it was one of the strangest cases they had ever seen. Footprints walking backward, no forced entry, and no sign of the intruder after the storm. Years later, Mark still checks the roof every Christmas Eve. He installs new locks, new alarms, new lights, but nothing feels secure. Sometimes when the wind howls just right, he hears whispers outside, faint and deliberate, calling to him, testing him. And every year, without fail, a single large footprint appears in the snow outside their house, always disappearing before anyone else can see it. Neighbors tell stories claiming they've seen a figure in the woods, but nobody approaches. The Thompsons moved once, but the terror followed them. Strange noises, missing items, and footprints that appear and vanish. Christmas, the holiday meant for warmth and family, became a season of dread, a reminder that something unseen, something patient, was always watching. Even now, long after that first Christmas Eve, Mark can't shake the feeling that the figure is waiting, somewhere just beyond the edge of the forest, knowing he's watching back, counting down the nights until it returns. Story the end. The snow was falling heavier than usual that Christmas Eve in the small town of Millersville, Pennsylvania. The streets were lined with twinkling lights and the faint scent of pine from the abundant trees scattered throughout town. Families bustled about, shopping for last-minute gifts, while kids dragged their parents to see the holiday displays in the downtown square. But for the Hawkins family, this Christmas was shaping up to be anything but festive. David Hawkins, a local mechanic, had spent the day in his garage fixing a neighbor's old pickup, his hands blackened with grease. His wife, Karen, had spent the morning preparing Christmas dinner, but her mind had been elsewhere, worried about their eldest son, Tyler. Tyler had been acting strange for weeks, withdrawn and sullen, claiming he felt watched. David had chalked it up to teenage moodiness, but Karen couldn't shake a growing unease. By late afternoon, the family gathered in their cozy living room, decorated with a modest tree adorned with ornaments from past years. The scent of cinnamon and roast turkey filled the air, but the warmth of the room was disrupted by a sudden, chilling gust of wind that rattled the windows. Karen frowned, moving to close the curtains, but paused when she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow, fleeting and human-shaped, passing behind the glass. "Probably just a neighbor," she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. Dinner was tense. Tyler barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on the window as if expecting someone or something to appear. His younger sister, Emily, tried to keep the mood light, humming Christmas carols softly, but even her voice couldn't mask the growing tension. When the family finally retired for the evening, Karen tucked Emily into bed, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. She peeked into Tyler's room and found him staring at his ceiling, eyes wide, fingers trembling. "I saw him again," Tyler whispered when Karen entered. "He's outside, watching us." Karen knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Tyler, it's just the storm. Snow can play tricks on your eyes. There's nobody out there." Tyler shook his head violently. "No, Mom, it's not the snow. He's real. He's waiting." David tried to reassure both of them when he returned from the garage, checking locks on doors and windows, muttering under his breath about the wind. But as night fell and the storm intensified, the unease in the house grew. Outside, the snow turned into an almost blinding white, and the usual quiet of a snowy Christmas night was broken by strange, intermittent noises, footsteps crunching outside, soft but deliberate. Around 10 o'clock, the power flickered and went out. plunging the house into darkness. Karen lit candles, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Tyler's anxiety escalated, and Emily clutched her doll, whispering that she didn't like the dark. David checked the fuse box in the basement, cursing when he saw nothing obvious wrong, but the feeling of dread was undeniable. Then came the knock. Soft at first, almost hesitant but deliberate. 3 knocks, spaced evenly, coming from the front door. David froze, heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called, his voice louder than intended. Silence answered. He grabbed a flashlight and peered through the peephole, but nothing was there. Just snow swirling in the weak light from the street lamp. "Probably some drunk kid," he muttered, though his words rang hollow. Karen wasn't convinced. Tyler, pale and wide-eyed, whispered, "He's here. He's outside." The knocking continued, growing louder, now accompanied by scratching along the siding of the house. The sound was unnatural, jagged, almost inhuman. David grabbed a baseball bat from the corner, moving cautiously toward the door, every step careful against the creaking floorboards. Karen held Emily tightly, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. David flung open the door. Snow poured in with the cold wind, but no one was there. The porch was empty, pristine snow covering the ground, disturbed only by a single set of footprints, large, too large for any normal man or boy. They led to the edge of the yard and stopped abruptly. David's stomach churned. He called out, demanding whoever was there identify themselves, but the only response was the storm. He closed the door, bolting it again, but the scratching continued, now inside. Karen screamed as they realized the sound was coming from the basement. David, trying to stay rational, moved slowly down the stairs, flashlight in hand. The air was damp and cold, more so than usual, and the scent of something metallic and foul lingered. At the bottom, the light revealed scrawled symbols on the walls, lines and circles that glowed faintly in the dark, a pattern that seemed almost alive. The basement door slammed shut behind him. David spun, heart racing, and the flashlight flickered. Then he saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, face obscured beneath a tattered hood, standing silently in the far corner. Its eyes, glowing faintly red, locked onto his. He stumbled back, shouting, but the figure didn't move. Tyler's voice echoed from upstairs, trembling and urgent. "Dad, he's in the house. He's here with us." Karen grabbed Emily and retreated toward the kitchen, phone in hand, trying desperately to get a signal. There was none. David backed further into the basement, knowing the figure was following his every movement, a silent predator. The symbols on the wall pulsed, and a cold, unnatural wind swept through the basement, carrying whispers in a language David couldn't comprehend. Suddenly, the figure lunged, not at David but past him toward the stairs. David ran after it, fumbling in the dark, but when he reached the top, Tyler and Emily were gone. Panic seized him as Karen screamed from the kitchen. He turned and saw them, both children frozen in place, staring at the window, eyes wide with terror. Outside, the figure waited, impossibly tall against the white blur of snow, reaching a skeletal hand toward them. David's blood ran cold. He tried to pull the children away, but they were rooted to the spot, unable to respond. The front door rattled violently as though something massive was trying to force its way in. Karen screamed for him to run, but David couldn't leave the children. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy chair, and hurled it at the window. It shattered, snow and wind rushing in, but the figure remained outside, unfazed, its red eyes fixed on the family. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the storm cleared. The wind stopped, the snow ceased, the figure was gone. The children collapsed to the floor, sobbing and trembling. David and Karen held them tightly, unwilling to speak, afraid that if they did, the nightmare would resume. Morning came slowly, and with it, neighbors began to appear, checking on the Hawkins family after seeing the broken window from the street. Everything outside was perfectly normal, snow untouched except for the single set of enormous footprints leading up to the house and vanishing at the edge of the yard. No one had seen anyone pass through the storm. The family never spoke openly about that Christmas again. Tyler's behavior changed, even more withdrawn and distant. Emily refused to go near the window. David and Karen installed additional locks, alarms, and even cameras, but the unease never fully left them. Some nights the sound of scratching would return, soft at first, coming from the basement or outside the door, always reminding them that the figure hadn't left, that it was still waiting, watching, marking its time. Years later, the Hawkins family moved away, but their story lingered in Millersville. Locals whispered about a figure seen in the snow on certain Christmas Eves, far taller than any human, its glowing eyes watching from the tree line, waiting. And those who claimed to see it swore that the feeling of being watched was far worse than the snow, far worse than the cold. It was a feeling that lingered, permanent and suffocating, the kind that leaves a mark you can never scrub away. And every Christmas, the Hawkins children, grown now, scattered across the country, would awake in the middle of the night, sweating and shaking, feeling eyes upon them, knowing that whatever had visited that night in Millersville was not bound by distance or time. Story the end. Snow had been falling all day, thick and relentless, the kind that muffled sounds and blurred the edges of the world. I was driving down Route 211 in rural Virginia, my headlights cutting through the white haze, on my way to my parents' house for Christmas. Normally, I loved this drive, quiet roads, the occasional deer darting across the clearing, but that night, everything felt wrong. The sky had a strange pale green tint, like the air itself was sick. The farmhouse my parents lived in sat at the end of a long driveway, flanked by pine trees that bent under the weight of snow. The house had been in the family for generations, and I had grown up there. But this year, with my parents away visiting relatives and my younger brother away with friends, I was the only one staying behind. Heather, my neighbor, had stopped by earlier, dropping off a plate of cookies and warning me to stay inside after dark. "The roads aren't safe," she'd said. I waved her off, but now, driving down that snow-laden lane, I understood what she meant. Halfway down the driveway, I noticed something strange in the snow ahead. A figure, just standing there, motionless. I slammed on the brakes. My car skidded slightly on the icy surface, and for a heartbeat, I thought it was a person stranded in the snow needing help. But as I slowed to a crawl, my stomach sank. The figure was off. Too tall, too thin, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't move like a human. And then, impossibly, it raised a hand and waved, slowly, deliberately. I slammed the car into reverse and skidded back, the tires spitting snow in every direction. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The snow had obliterated any trace of it. I told myself I had imagined it, that my brain was playing tricks after the long day of travel and stress. I parked the car, heart hammering, and trudged through the snow to the front door. The wind howled, tugging at my coat and chilling my bones. When I entered, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, the old wood would creak and groan, the pipes would moan, the house alive with the sound of settling, but tonight it was deathly silent. I turned on the lights, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The tree my parents had decorated gleamed with soft white lights, ornaments glinting, but there was an emptiness to it, an absence that pressed down on me. I set my bags down and tried to focus on normal things, checking the fireplace, lighting a candle, making myself a cup of cocoa. Then I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. There was no wind. The snow outside clung in place, muffling everything. I slowly approached the window. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. Silence. Only the tapping continued, gentle, deliberate, coming from the window at the corner of the living room. I stepped back, heart racing. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. Maybe a branch, a piece of snow falling from the roof. But the tapping continued even when I moved away. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was nothing. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, but the unease clung to me. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak louder. I kept glancing at the staircase leading to the second floor. For some reason, it felt like it was watching me. I forced myself upstairs, reasoning that the sound might have come from an open window in one of the bedrooms. Each step groaned under my weight. I checked the first room. Empty. The second, empty. The third, empty, except for a small box I didn't recognize on the dresser. Curious, I opened it. Inside were old Christmas ornaments, dusty, yellowed with age. But at the very bottom was something that made my stomach flip. A small folded note. The handwriting was familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. It read, in jagged letters, "I see you." I dropped the note, my hands trembled. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, but the house was supposed to be empty, and then I heard it. Footsteps. Upstairs. Slow, deliberate, pacing the hall outside the door. "Heather?" I called, though Heather was across town. Mom? Dad? No answer, only the footsteps, circling, approaching, retreating. I gripped the banister, heart pounding. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Then a whisper, soft but unmistakable, "Come upstairs." The voice was hoarse, almost raspy. Not quite human. My instincts screamed at me to run, to hide, but some part of me, morbid and foolish, wanted to see what it was. I edged toward the hallway. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed down so heavily I could hear my own breathing. Then upstairs, the attic door creaked open. I had no memory of moving toward it. It was like my body had decided for me. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't hold the doorknob properly. Finally, I managed to push it open. The attic was dark, filled with dust motes floating in the dim light from the small window. The air smelled of old wood and something else, something metallic, like blood. And then I saw it, a figure crouched in the corner, unmoving. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, its limbs impossibly long. The head tilted at a terrible angle, and its eyes were black voids that seemed to pierce right through me. My stomach turned, my legs threatened to give out, but I couldn't look away. The figure whispered again, low and hollow, "Not enough. Never enough." I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and the attic door slammed shut on its own. I ran downstairs, the air thick, almost suffocating, the lights flickering as if the house itself were alive and angry. I grabbed my coat and car keys, intent on leaving, but when I opened the front door, snow swirled around me, and a scream tore through the night. It sounded like someone calling my name. My name. But the voice was distant, muffled, carried by the wind. I ran, slipping in the snow, and reached my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw it again in the corner of the driveway. The figure. Only now, it was closer, moving with unnatural speed, gliding across the snow without leaving prints. Its long arms reached out and its head tilted further, impossibly. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and slammed it into gear. The tires skidded across the ice, snow spraying everywhere. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure stood in the middle of the driveway, watching me leave, tilting its head as though it were amused. I drove all night, never looking back, until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I pulled into a rest area and finally dared to breathe. The road behind me was empty. The snow was undisturbed, except for my tire tracks. There was no sign of the creature, no evidence that it had even existed. When I finally returned to the house with the police a few days later, everything was normal. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, no attic figure. The only thing I found was the small box of old ornaments and the note that had vanished. To this day, every Christmas, when the snow falls thick and quiet, I hear it in my dreams. Footsteps pacing the hallway, whispers from the attic, and that hollow, insistent voice telling me it's never enough. And sometimes in the corner of my eye, I see it, standing in the shadows, tilting its head, watching, waiting. I've never spent another Christmas alone in that house. I've never stayed after dark. And every year, when the wind howls and the snow drifts heavy across the countryside, I remember, some things come home for Christmas. Story the end. The snow was coming down in thick sheets the night I got stranded on the back roads of northern Pennsylvania. I'd been driving from Erie to my parents' place in a tiny township outside of Meadville for Christmas Eve. Usually it was a 3-hour drive, but the storm had slowed everything to a crawl. My old sedan felt every gust of wind, rattling in protest as I gripped the steering wheel like it was a lifeline. I'd driven these roads hundreds of times, but tonight the familiar turns and hills felt foreign, like I'd entered another world buried under ice and fog. By the time I passed the last gas station, an abandoned shell, boarded windows rattling, I realized the snow was getting deeper and the road was starting to disappear. My headlights barely cut through more than a few feet. Then I saw it, a stretch of road completely blocked by a fallen tree. I slammed the brakes and skidded to a stop, my car fishtailing on the ice. The storm was relentless, and the isolation hit me hard. I had no cell service, no help coming, and the wind whipped so fiercely that even the thought of stepping outside was terrifying. I sat there for a long minute, trying to calm down. My hands were numb from gripping the wheel, my breath fogging the inside of the windshield. I looked around. Nothing. Nothing. Just the white blur of the storm. Then, in the distance, I noticed a faint yellow light. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the storm, but as I squinted, it didn't move. It was steady, flickering softly, like a candle burning behind a window. I decided to investigate. I stepped out, the wind nearly knocking me over, and trudged through the snow toward the light. My boots sank deep with every step, and the cold bit through my jacket and gloves. The light grew slowly as I approached, revealing a small farmhouse sitting off the road. The house looked old, almost like it had been frozen in time, with icicles hanging from the eaves and a crooked wreath on the door. Warm light spilled from the windows, cutting through the blizzard. I knocked, shivering violently. No answer. Then I tried the doorknob. Locked. I rapped harder. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing an old woman. She looked frail, with gray hair tied back tightly, and her eyes were sharp, almost unnervingly so. "Come in," she said, voice thin but firm. "You'll freeze out there." I stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. The interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and something metallic. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and Christmas decorations hung in a way that suggested the house had seen many holidays, though none recently. A small tree sat in the corner, unlit, dust-covered ornaments dangling from its branches. My car is stuck," I said, rubbing my hands together. "I thought I saw a light." "You're lucky to have found me," she said, glancing at me carefully. "The storm can be unforgiving." She gestured toward a chair near the fireplace. "Sit." I sank into it, letting the warmth of the fire chase the cold from my bones. She moved silently, bringing over a mug of what smelled like hot chocolate. I took a sip, and it was sweet but had a strange, metallic tang I couldn't place. "Thank you," I said. She nodded but didn't sit with me. Instead, she moved toward the kitchen, humming softly. I watched her, noting how the shadows from the fire danced across the room. Something felt off. It wasn't the cold or the storm. It was the house. It was too quiet. Too still. I tried to make small talk, asking her if she had family visiting for Christmas. Her eyes flickered briefly toward the tree, then back at me. "Family doesn't come anymore," she said softly. "Not for a long time." I didn't press. The storm raged outside, and I had nowhere else to go. I drank the cocoa, trying to shake the unease building in my chest. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. The storm made it hard to tell. The wind outside became almost a living thing, howling around the corners of the house. Then I heard it, a scratching sound at the back door. I froze, listening. Scratching again, slow and deliberate. My heart started to race. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, but I didn't believe it. The scratching grew louder. Then came a low, guttural moan, muffled by the walls but unmistakably out there. Something heavy pressed against the door, testing it, pushing, scratching. The old woman came into the room, her face calm. "Don't worry," she said softly. "They like to come around this time of year. They won't get in." "They?" I asked, voice trembling. She smiled faintly, not looking at me. "The visitors. They come when the snow falls, when the wind sings." I wanted to laugh, to call her crazy, but the sound outside silenced me. Something was out there, large and moving in ways that didn't make sense. Scratches ran down the door in deep gouges, and the glass of the small window beside it rattled. I wanted to leave, but she blocked my path. "It's safer to stay," she said. "They only watch. Sometimes they take." "What do you mean, take?" I asked, panic rising. She shrugged lightly. "People wander into the storm. Some find their way here. Some don't. You found me. That's all that matters tonight." I stayed in the chair, gripping the blanket she had given me, listening to the thing outside. It circled the house, scratching, moaning, dragging something across the snow. Hours passed. I thought dawn would never come. The wind eventually died down, and the sound outside stopped. When I finally dared to look outside, the world was silent. Snow covered everything, sparkling in the weak morning light. I exhaled, relieved, but when I turned back to the house, the old woman was gone. Every trace of her vanished. The mugs, the chair, the fire, all cold and untouched. I stumbled outside, confused, my boots crunching in the fresh snow. The farmhouse was still there, but I noticed something strange. No footprints led to or from the door. No evidence she had been inside. Just the snow, untouched, except for the deep drag marks circling the house. Something massive had moved around it all night. I ran back toward the road, following my own footprints from the night before. My car was still there, engine cold, buried in a foot of snow. As I brushed it off and started the ignition, I caught sight of something at the edge of the trees. A figure, indistinct, hunched, just watching. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else. I floored it, and the figure didn't move, didn't follow, just stood there, silhouetted in the pale morning light. When I finally made it to the next town, I stopped at a diner, shaking, still tasting that metallic tang in my mouth. I tried to tell the waitress what happened. She looked at me with polite concern, but said, "You must mean the old Granger place. Been burned down for over 20 years. Nobody lives there." I laughed nervously. "No, I was just there." She shook her head. "Honey, you're not the first to say that. Folks get lost in the storm. They see things. Sometimes folks never come back from that road." I left the diner and drove the rest of the way to my parents' house in silence. I didn't speak of it again, though I could never shake the memory. The warmth, the metallic cocoa, the scratching at the door, and the sense that something had been watching me all night. Even now, every Christmas, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls, I think of that house, and I wonder if the old woman and whatever circled that house are still out there, waiting for the next traveler unlucky enough to find themselves alone in the storm. Story the end. Snow had been falling for hours, thick and relentless, turning the small town of Hallow Creek, Pennsylvania, into a frozen postcard. The streets were empty, the usual Christmas cheer muted under the heavy weight of white. I was driving my old pickup truck back from a last-minute shopping run, the kind of errands you put off until Christmas Eve because life insists on being busy. My parents' cabin, where we always celebrated, sat a half hour outside town, up a winding road that disappeared into the pines. I was eager to get there, eager to escape the cold loneliness of my apartment and the echoing absence of my younger brother, who had moved across the country 2 years ago. The road narrowed as I drove, headlights cutting through the snowstorm. The wind howled like something alive, forcing me to slow down to barely more than a crawl. At some point, I realized the snow had started to collect in deep drifts along the sides of the road, threatening to trap me if I didn't maintain traction. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, thinking about the fire waiting in the cabin, the smell of pine from the tree I planned to decorate, and the quiet that always felt like safety in this remote place. I reached the cabin as night fell. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the windows glowed with a soft, welcoming light. I parked and trudged up the snowy path, bags in hand, the snow crunching under my boots. Inside, everything smelled like pine and old wood. My mother had left some decorations up from last year, a half-finished gingerbread village, candles, and the tree, sparsely decorated but warm in its lights. I set down the bags, struck a match, and got the fireplace going. The sudden warmth was comforting, but I couldn't shake the unease that had been creeping in during the drive. Something about this Christmas felt off. Around 8, I went outside to clear a path for the driveway. The snow had piled up quickly, and my footprints disappeared almost as soon as I made them. That's when I saw them. Fresh tracks in the snow leading up from the tree line. At first, I thought it was a deer or a rabbit, but the prints were far too big, deep, human-sized, and they stopped right at the edge of the porch. No continuation, no return path. Just a sudden stop, as if whoever or whatever was there had frozen mid-step. I froze, heart hammering. The forest had been silent, but now I could swear I heard faint shuffling between the trees. I convinced myself it was just the wind, just branches falling under the weight of snow. I went inside, locked the doors, and tried to put it out of my mind. By 10, I was sitting near the fire with a mug of coffee, trying to calm down, when I heard the first knock. Sharp, deliberate, echoing through the cabin. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the door. It came from the window. I glanced over just in time to see a dark figure reflected in the glass. Tall, thin, motionless. I couldn't make out features, only the outline of someone standing there, staring. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam toward the window. Nothing. Snow swirled in the air, catching the light, but the figure was gone. My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped the mug. I locked the windows again and drew the curtains tight, telling myself it had to be a trick of the light or exhaustion. Around midnight, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to sleep, when I heard it, the soft thump of footsteps on the porch roof. My eyes snapped open. The cabin roof was old and slanted, not designed to support weight, yet I could hear something moving above me. Slow, careful steps. A scrape against the shingles. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then a loud thump, as if someone had jumped, and the sound of sliding against the wood. The silence that followed was unbearable. I eventually drifted into a fitful sleep, waking hours later to gray morning light. When I finally got the courage to look outside, my stomach dropped. 3 figures stood at the edge of the clearing where the trees met the snow. Their faces were hidden by old burlap sacks tied tightly at the neck. Their clothes were ragged, almost antique. They stood perfectly still, just watching. I blinked, thinking I was still dreaming. But they were real. I stayed inside all morning, watching them through cracks in the curtains. At one point, they moved, gliding through the snow toward the tree line, then disappearing. It was impossible to tell if they were walking normally or sliding over the snow like shadows. By late afternoon, the wind had died down, leaving a dead silence over the cabin. I debated calling the sheriff, but there was no cell signal. The nearest landline was miles away, and even then, who would believe me? I considered waiting until daylight to drive out, but as night approached, I realized staying in the cabin another hour was too dangerous. I packed a backpack with essentials, flashlight, blanket, food, and prepared to leave. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made me freeze. Footprints. Dozens of them circling the cabin in a deliberate pattern. Fresh snow hadn't covered them, but their depth suggested weight, persistence, intent. The tracks didn't lead away. They led everywhere around me. Then I heard movement behind me. Crunching snow. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the shadow of a tree, swaying. I ran to the truck, fumbling with keys, my breath catching in the cold air. My tires spun in the snow as I fought to get moving, and that's when I saw them again. Figures emerging from the tree line, 5, 6 more. More. All tall, all wearing burlap masks. They didn't run, they didn't shout, they just walked toward the truck in slow, deliberate steps. I floored it. The truck fishtailed, spun, caught, then roared down the narrow road. I didn't look back, but in the rearview mirror, I could see them standing at the entrance to the drive, watching, motionless. I didn't stop until I reached the town, where lights and people gave a sense of safety I hadn't felt in hours. I sat in the truck for what felt like forever, gripping the wheel, shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, I returned briefly to gather a few things I'd left behind. When I looked at the truck, my stomach turned. Deep, jagged scratches ran along both sides, metal clawed and gouged. Under the windshield wiper, frozen in a sheet of ice, was a piece of burlap, stiff and worn. On it, scrawled in what looked like dark red paint or something worse, were 2 words, "We watched." I never went back to that cabin. I sold it quietly, cheaply, to someone else who probably never knew what had happened. But each Christmas, when snow falls thick and the wind moans through the trees, I can't stop remembering the tall masked figures, their silent, deliberate movements, the way they circled the cabin as if marking it, preparing it, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine them still out there in the woods, waiting for the next Christmas, for the next person who thinks they're safe in the quiet alone. And I know deep down, if I ever returned, they would remember me. Story the end. The snow was falling hard when I arrived in my hometown of Brimfield, Ohio for Christmas. The roads were barely plowed, and the wind cut through my jacket like icy knives. I hadn't been back in years, not since the divorce and Mom's funeral the previous spring. Dad had insisted I come, said he needed company, though his voice on the phone sounded weak, tired, like someone carrying the weight of a long winter on his shoulders. The house hadn't changed much. The porch light flickered as I stepped onto the icy steps, and I noticed the familiar wreath Dad had hung every year, except it was crooked, half hanging off the nail. I rang the doorbell. There was no answer. I tried the handle. Unlocked. "Dad?" I called into the dark entryway. The smell hit me first. A mix of dust, wood smoke, and something else. Rotten. I followed the smell into the living room, where I found him slumped in his recliner, asleep, a half-empty mug of cocoa on the side table. "Hey, Dad," I said gently. He stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He smiled at me, but there was fear there too, a tightness around his eyes that wasn't familiar. "You made it," he said hoarsely. "Came through the storm?" I nodded. "Of course. I wasn't about to let you be alone for Christmas." He waved me over to the couch. "Sit. Don't move too much. The storm, it's worse than they say." I noticed the house was quiet. Too quiet. Mom always had music playing, or the TV humming, or the tiny wind-up train running along the mantel during Christmas. This year, nothing, only the wind outside. After some small talk, Dad excused himself to his room. I tried not to notice the way he avoided the attic door at the end of the hall. He didn't have to say anything. I already knew not to ask about it. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, listening to the wind lash against the windows, when I heard it. A soft, deliberate tapping. Footsteps above me, slow and uneven, like someone dragging their feet across the attic floor. My first thought was Dad, but he was snoring lightly in his room. I stayed frozen until the sound stopped. Then I heard it again, this time right above my head. Something moved across the attic floor with deliberate weight. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried to convince myself it was the house settling. The next morning, I found Dad in the kitchen staring blankly at the window. He looked older somehow, thinner, his face drawn tight. "Did you hear it last night?" I asked. "Hear what?" "The footsteps, in the attic." He shook his head. "You didn't. Don't go up there." "Why not? What's up there?" His hands trembled as he poured himself coffee. "Nothing you'd want to see. Just leave it." I left it alone, but the sense of wrongness in the house grew with each hour. Shadows in the corners of my vision, the cold spots that followed me from room to room, the feeling that I was being watched, even when Dad was there. By the third day, the storm had worsened. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind rattled the eaves like a living thing. Dad was more withdrawn, quieter, moving like he didn't want to disturb something. That night, I finally gave in. I had to see for myself. I crept up the narrow stairs to the attic, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. I pulled the cord, and the attic door creaked open. The smell hit me immediately. Dust, mold, and iron. Something rotten. Boxes of Mom's Christmas decorations were stacked neatly, but all of them had been pushed back a foot or more, leaving a dark, empty space behind. I froze. Footprints, bare, small, dragging, cut through the dust. They led straight into the gap between the wall and the boxes. I barely had time to react before something slammed the attic door behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the door was just a foot away. I pulled it open and bolted down the stairs. Dad was standing at the bottom, eyes wide, his face pale. "I told you not to go up there," he whispered. "Why? What is it?" I demanded. He shook his head violently. "You don't want to know. Just don't make it angry." That night, the sounds started again, tapping, dragging, whispering my name. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or exhaustion or stress, but the voice was clear. My name, drawn out in a low, rasping tone that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I got out of bed and found Dad in the living room, frozen, staring at the hallway. "I hear it," he said. "It wants something." "What?" I asked, voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just held onto the blanket around his shoulders and refused to move. The power went out around midnight. The house plunged into darkness, the only light the flicker of the fireplace. The wind screamed, rattling windows as tearing at the siding. I heard it first at the front door, slamming, pounding, something heavy hitting the wood as if it were alive. I grabbed the fireplace poker and approached, but Dad caught my arm. "Don't," he hissed. "Why? It's outside," I said. "No, it's inside," he whispered. I froze. A long, dragging sound moved through the hallway toward us. Something slow, deliberate, heavy. I could hear its breath now, wet and rattling, right in front of the closed door. I stepped into the hallway, empty, only the shadows twisting unnaturally around the furniture. The attic door at the far end of the hall creaked open slowly, as if pushed by some unseen force. I saw it then, a figure on the top step. Too tall, too thin, limbs crooked. Head tilted unnaturally. Hollow, dark eyes fixed on me. A grin split its face. I screamed. I screamed. Dad screamed. The figure vanished into the attic. We tried to leave, bundled in coats and boots, snow up to our knees. But halfway down the driveway, Dad collapsed, shaking violently, eyes wide and blank. Something cold and heavy pressed against my shoulder. A hand. Too thin, too cold. I blacked out. I woke in a hospital bed. Neighbors had found me dragging Dad through the snow. They said he was dead before they got there. Exposure, shock. I didn't argue. I couldn't. Weeks later, I returned to the house to collect Dad's things. The attic door was open. Dust covered the floor, but new footprints led to the gap behind the boxes. Bare footprints, my size, and I knew without a doubt that it hadn't finished with me. Story the end. Snow drifted across the empty highway as if the wind were trying to bury it before morning came. I had been driving for hours, heading north through rural Pennsylvania toward the old farmhouse where my sister, Heather, insisted we all meet for Christmas. She had bought the place earlier that year, a creaking, drafty home built in the 1890s and sitting on 20 acres of woods. She loved the isolation. I didn't. But she begged me to come early, said she needed help getting the place ready. I told myself I wasn't tired, even though my eyes fought to stay open. The radio had long since drifted into static. My phone barely held a signal, and the snow, heavy and blowing sideways, thinned the world around me until I felt as if I were driving through a tunnel of white. It was just after 10 p.m. when I saw something in the road. A figure. I jerked the wheel, the car fishtailing before correcting. My heart slammed against my ribs. At first I thought it was a deer, but deer didn't stand upright, didn't lift an arm as if trying to wave down a passing car. I slowed to a crawl, leaning forward, squinting through the frost on the windshield. But the road was empty. I let the car idle, scanning the snow-filled darkness. My breath fogged the cabin. I told myself the drifting snow had played tricks on me, creating a shape out of nothing. Maybe exhaustion had. I was seeing things. I kept driving. By the time I reached the farm's long gravel drive, the wind had died down. The moonlight glowed off the fields, lighting the house and barn in a pale, cold sheen. Heather's SUV was parked near the porch. I stepped out, the cold biting immediately through my coat. The house was dark except for a single window lit upstairs. I grabbed my duffel from the trunk and crunched across the snow, each step sounding unnaturally loud. When I opened the front door, warm air rushed out, smelling faintly of pine and something else, maybe old wood or dust. "Heather?" I called. No answer. I kicked off my shoes and stepped into the living room. Boxes of decorations were piled around the tree she hadn't finished putting together. The place looked half moved in, half abandoned. "Heather?" I said louder. Still nothing. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it, a soft, sharp tapping. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from down the hallway, near the bedroom with the light on. My skin prickled, the hair rising at the back of my neck. "Heath? You up there?" Tap, tap. I reached the door and pushed it open. The room was empty. A small lamp glowed on the nightstand, but no one was in the bed, and no one stood at the window. Yet the tapping continued. Tap, tap, tap. Very softly on the glass. I stepped closer. "Okay, seriously, if this is a joke, not funny." I pulled back the curtain, tapped. Nothing outside but snow and the dark outline of the woods. But the tapping persisted. Right in front of me, except now I could see that nothing was touching the glass. Nothing at all. The sound was coming from inside the room. I stepped back. The tapping stopped. A chill crawled down my spine. I shut the curtain and went back downstairs, telling myself the house was drafty and old, that wood made strange noises. I found a note on the kitchen counter. Went into town for groceries. Back soon. H. Except the note was dated the day before. I frowned. Why wouldn't she just text? Why leave a note and never come back? My phone buzzed weakly with 1 bar of service. I tried calling her, but the call dropped immediately. I tried again. Dropped. Snow hit the windows, first lightly, then harder, clicking against the glass like fingernails. I wandered room to room, turning on lights, trying to shake off the growing unease. This was an old farmhouse. Old houses made noises, had drafts, settled in strange ways. But when I went into the guest room, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A single fresh footprint in the snow on the inside windowsill. Just one. As if something with a bare human foot had stepped inside. I backed out, heart racing. I forced myself to check the window. It was locked. Completely locked. No sign of forced entry. For a long moment, I just stood there, breathing hard, trying to steady myself. The house seemed to listen, every creak echoing too clearly in the silence. I decided to start a fire in the living room. Settling down in front of it felt like the most normal thing I could do. I knelt by the fireplace, stacking logs, striking a match. The flame flared up, and then, clear as day, footsteps on the floorboards above me. Slow, heavy, human. I froze. "Heather?" I called again, but smaller this time. The footsteps stopped. Silence pressed down like heavy snow on a roof. I stood, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. Very wrong. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace, not much of a weapon, but better than nothing, and crept toward the staircase. Halfway up, the house groaned loudly, as if shifting its weight. The footsteps started again, quicker this time, pacing the upstairs landing, back and forth. My heart pounded in my ears. When I reached the top, the footsteps stopped abruptly, like whatever was making them had suddenly realized I was there. My throat tightened. I stepped slowly along the hall, gripping the poker so tightly my hand ached. Then a whisper, just behind me. "Help!" I spun, swinging the poker wildly. No one there. The whisper had sounded like Heather. I forced myself down the hallway, checking each room. Empty, empty, empty. At the last door, the attic stairwell, my hand shook as I reached for the knob. Before I touched it, something scratched the door from the other side. Not hard. Soft. Fingertips. My breath caught in my throat. "Heath?" I whispered. The scratching stopped. Then, knocking. 3 slow knocks. From inside the attic, my body went cold. I backed away, not daring to turn my back, then nearly ran downstairs. Every instinct told me to get out. Leave. Drive away and call the police from somewhere with reception. I grabbed my coat, my keys. When I yanked open the front door, snow gusted in. And something else, a sound carried faintly on the wind. A scream. A woman's scream. From the woods. I froze. It sounded like Heather. I couldn't leave. Not now. I pulled on my boots and trudged into the snow, the cold stinging my face. The scream echoed again, deeper in the trees. I followed it, heart hammering, breath burning in my chest. About 50 yards in, I found tracks, bare footprints, human, leading deeper into the dark. I followed them until I reached a clearing. There, half buried in snow, lay a burlap sack. My pulse roared in my ears. I hurried to it, kneeling, brushing snow away. The sack was tied with a thick rope, knotted tightly. Something inside shifted, thumping weakly against the fabric. I tore at the knot with numb fingers, finally ripping it open. Inside was my sister's phone, still recording. The screen showed nothing but blackness, but the audio was terrible. Heather sobbing, whispering, begging something to please let her go, telling it she had brought everything it asked for. Then a voice that wasn't human, low, dragging, almost amused. Not enough. Never enough. The recording ended. I staggered back, horror rising like bile. The trees around me creaked, the wind moaned through the branches, and then footsteps behind me. Slow, crunching in the snow, I turned. A figure stood between the trees, thin, impossibly tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin looked pale, almost translucent in the moonlight. Something like frost clung to its hair. But worst of all were its eyes. Black, empty, hungry. I stumbled backward, my breath choking in my throat. The thing stepped forward, one long, bare foot pressing softly into the snow. Another step, and another. I turned and ran. Branches whipped my face. The cold tore at my lungs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst from the tree line and sprinted toward the house, slipping, falling, scrambling back up. When I reached the porch, I dared one glance behind me. The woods were still. Silent. The thing was gone. I rushed inside and slammed the door, locking it, then dragged a heavy cabinet in front of it. I stumbled back, shaking so violently my teeth clattered. Then footsteps upstairs again. Soft. Careful, like something creeping along the hall. I pressed myself against the wall, staring up the staircase. A shadow moved, slowly, reaching long across the landing. A low whisper drifted down. "Cold night, isn't it?" My breath caught. The attic door creaked open. I bolted into the kitchen, grabbing the phone from the counter, dialing 911 even with one bar. It rang. Once. Twice. Then the line clicked. A long exhale filled my ear like someone breathing right against the phone, followed by, "Behind you." The line went dead. I spun, slamming my back against the fridge, but nothing stood there. No one. The lights flickered, then went out. Only the faint glow of the dying fire lit the room. I heard movement in the hallway. Slow footfalls dragging across the floor. I clutched the poker again, holding it out in front of me. A shape appeared in the doorway. Small, hunched. "Heather," I whispered. The shape stepped closer. Not Heather. It was the thing from the woods, its limbs folding grotesquely to fit in the narrow doorway. Its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of small, needle-like teeth. I stumbled back, knocking pans from the counter. The poker shook in my hand. "You brought me home," it whispered, voice scraping like ice on glass. "A gift for Christmas." It lunged. I swung wildly, metal connecting with a sickening crack. The creature shrieked, an ear-splitting inhuman sound, and staggered. I ran, darting into the living room, grabbing my keys from the couch. The creature slammed into the wall behind me, snarling. I ran for the door, shoving the cabinet aside, yanking the door open. Snow burst in. The creature screeched again, closer now. I fled into the freezing night, sprinting toward my car. My boots slipped on the icy ground, but I didn't stop. I reached the car, dove inside, fumbled with the keys, hands shaking violently. The engine stuttered, then roared to life. A pale face slammed against the driver's side window. I screamed, throwing the car into reverse, skidding wildly down the drive. The creature chased me, impossibly fast, its long limbs slicing through the snow. At the end of the drive, I swerved onto the highway, tires spinning, the car fishtailing until it gripped the road. In the rearview mirror, the creature stood in the middle of the drive, watching, its head tilting slowly. Then it stepped backward into the woods and vanished. I didn't stop driving until I reached town. When I finally found police, they searched the house, the woods, everything. They found nothing. No footprints. No creature. No Heather. Only her phone, still recording, found in the snow where I had left it. They told me exhaustion played tricks on people, that stress and bad weather caused hallucinations. But I know what I saw. I know what followed me. And every Christmas since, when the wind is just right and the night is just cold enough, I still hear it tapping on my window. Tap, 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 like it's reminding me it knows where I am, and it's patient. Story the end. Snow had been falling since early morning, drifting in slow, lazy spirals that made the whole street look softer than it really was. It was Christmas Eve, and the quiet suburban neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina, had settled into the stillness that came after families shut their blinds and retreated into warm living rooms. Most houses glowed with colorful lights, inflatable snowmen, and the faint golden flicker of fireplaces dancing through curtains. But the Whitaker house, sitting at the end of the cul-de-sac where the pavement met the tree line, had no decorations up, not so much as a wreath. That wasn't unusual. Noah and his mother Rebecca didn't celebrate Christmas much anymore. Not after what happened to his older brother 3 years before. Noah was 16 now, tall, lanky, with hair falling into his eyes and the kind of permanent tired expression kids carried when they'd grown up too fast. He stared out the frosted window from the living room, watching the snow thicken. The power flickered once, then steadied. His mom came in carrying 2 mismatched mugs of hot cocoa. "I know you don't like it," she said, setting one in front of him, "but drinking something warm helps when the weather messes with your anxiety." "I'm not anxious," Noah muttered, though he didn't push the mug away. She sat across from him. "Storm's supposed to get worse later. If we're lucky, it won't knock the power out this time. If it does, we've got candles." His mom's eyes flickered for a moment, something dark passing through them before she looked away. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." He knew what she meant. There hadn't been a single lit candle in their house since the Christmas Eve of 2022, the night his brother Ethan never came home. Snow scratched faintly against the window as the flakes grew sharper, faster, more aggressive. Noah took a slow sip of cocoa, trying not to think about the other thing that happened that night, the thing he'd told himself 1,000 times wasn't real. A sharp knock rattled the front door. Both of them froze. His mom checked the time. Who on earth? The knock came again, louder, followed by a scraping sound across the door like something dragging thick fingernails over wood. Noah swallowed hard. Probably just a delivery guy. They always work weird hours during holidays. In a storm like this, she stood slowly and approached the door without turning on the porch light. Her hand hovered over the knob. "Hello?" she called. No answer. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the furnace kicking on. Then came a soft voice on the other side of the door, a child's voice. "Can I come inside?" Noah felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He stood instinctively. His mom's voice trembled. "Who are you?" Another scrape across the door, not impatient, almost playful. "I'm cold." Noah stepped closer, peering through the nearby window toward the porch. He saw nothing but swirling snow. No footprints, no dark shape of a child, nothing that should have made that voice so close. His breath fogged the glass. "Mom, don't open it." She backed away from the door as the voice came again, softer, closer. Too close. "Let me in. I'm freezing out here." Rebecca grabbed Noah's sleeve and pulled him toward the hallway. "Go to your room. Right now. I'm not leaving you. Go." He hesitated but obeyed. taking the stairs two at a time as the knocking started again. Faster this time, almost frantic. He shut his bedroom door and leaned against it, chest tight. The snowstorm roared outside now, branches whipping the siding, wind whistling through the chimney. Downstairs, the knocking stopped abruptly. Silence swallowed the house. And then, a single sound, soft but unmistakable. The front door creaked open. Noah's heart pounded in his throat. "Mom," he whispered. No answer. He pressed his ear against the door, listening. Something moved downstairs. Slow, heavy steps. Not the light tread of a child. Something dragging, something breathing. Then, whispering. Low, slow, almost melodic. Words he couldn't understand. Noah backed away from the door. The lights flickered again, then went out, plunging the house into darkness. He forced himself to stay calm, reaching for the flashlight in his desk drawer, but the moment he clicked it on, the beam flickered and died. Batteries drained instantly. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A single message from an unknown number. "Don't come down." He froze. The message repeated again. "Don't come down. Don't come down. Don't come down." 21 identical messages in less than 5 seconds. He turned his phone off, panic rising. Something brushed against his bedroom door. A faint, whispering breath seeped through the cracks like cold air. Noah, his mother's voice. Weak, broken, terrified. "Open the door." He stepped toward it, then stopped. Something was wrong. Her voice sounded strained, hollow, like someone else was pulling the words out of her. His mom wouldn't ask him to open the door in a blackout storm. She'd tell him to wait. "Mom," he whispered, "say something only you and I would know." Silence. Then, "The candles. We can't use candles." His blood ran cold. His mother would never reference that night. Not like that. Not in that tone. Another whisper slid under the door, almost playful. "Let me in, Noah." He stumbled backward. A moment later, something slammed against his door, shaking the frame. Then again. Louder. Harder. The hinges groaned. He grabbed his dresser and shoved it against the door just as another impact nearly splintered the wood. The voice outside warped, deepening, twisting. "Open the door." He covered his ears, eyes squeezing shut, heart racing. The banging grew violent, then stopped. Silence. A soft clicking sound followed, like something tapping along the hallway wall, moving away. He waited. Minutes passed in thick, suffocating quiet. Finally, he heard footsteps downstairs again. 2 sets now. One light, one heavy. Something dragged against the floorboards. Then he heard his mother scream. It was sharp, sudden, cut off halfway like someone had pressed a hand over her mouth. Noah ripped the dresser aside, adrenaline overriding fear. He cracked his door open. The hallway was pitch black except for a faint glow coming from downstairs. Candlelight. Noah's chest tightened. He moved slowly, quietly, keeping close to the wall as he crept down the stairs. The closer he got, the colder the air became, until his breath came out in white puffs. At the bottom step, he saw it. A single candle burning on the living room floor, wax dripping down its sides, the flames stretched unnaturally tall, flickering in a direction with no breeze. And next to the candle, his mother. She lay on her side, eyes open, breathing fast and shallow. Her hands were bound with something like twine or old rope, but darker, wet-looking. "Noah," she gasped, "don't look at it." He followed her gaze anyway. Near the doorway leading to the kitchen, a figure stood, small, child-sized, wearing an old-fashioned coat soaked with melted snow that dripped steadily onto the floor. Its head hung forward so he couldn't see its face. Behind the child's shape, something larger crouched, tall enough that its hunched form scraped the ceiling. Long limbs, too many joints. Skin the color of ash stretched tight over bones that didn't make sense. Its face was hidden behind the child's body. The child lifted its head. Its eyes were gone. Just smooth, pale skin. "Noah." The smaller one said, its voice no longer childlike but layered, echoing, wrong. "It's warm in here." The tall figure shifted, its elongated fingers scraping the wall and leaving deep grooves. The candle flickered wildly. Noah stepped in front of his mother. "What do you want?" The small one cocked its head. "You let us in." "I didn't open the door, but your mother did." Rebecca sobbed softly behind him. The larger figure began unfolding itself, rising, its height impossible in the small room, but somehow it fit, its limbs bending and twisting as it moved forward. The small one stepped closer to Noah. "The storm brought us. It always brings us. Last time, your brother ran from us." Noah's breath caught. The child shape smiled without a mouth. "We're faster now." Something inside him snapped, fear turning into pure instinct. He grabbed the candle and hurled it at the small figure. The flame extinguished midair, Sestri snuffed out unnaturally. Darkness surged in the room like a living thing. His mother screamed his name. The tall creature lunged. Noah grabbed her wrists and pulled, snapping the strange binding with more force than he knew he had. Run! They bolted toward the back door as footsteps, no, not footsteps, something more like crawling, chased them across the floor. The back door burst open with a blast of icy wind. They ran barefoot into the snow, slipping, scrambling, sprinting toward the neighbor's house. Behind them, the two shapes emerged onto the porch. The smaller one stepped into the snow without sinking at all. The larger one clung to the doorway like a spider. The child voice echoed across the yard. We'll come back next storm. Noah and his mother made it to the neighbor's house, pounding on the door until they were let in. The police arrived, searched the house, found nothing but deep gouges in the walls and long drag marks across the floor. No footprints in the snow except Noah's and his mother's. No sign of forced entry. The front door had been unlocked from the inside. They moved out of the house on December 27th. They never celebrated Christmas again. And every winter storm since then, even in their new apartment miles away, Noah swears he hears the same faint knock on the door. Light. Playful. Patient. Can I come inside? Story the end. Snow had already begun to drift sideways across the lonely stretch of highway when I passed the sign for Crestwood, a small mountain town I'd only ever heard about from my mom's stories. She'd grown up there before moving south, and for years she'd talked about going back for Christmas. But life always got in the way. Work, bills, everything else. It wasn't until after she died that I felt pulled to see the place for myself. I didn't have any real plan, just a need to feel connected to her somehow. I rented a small cabin a few miles outside of town, a place listed as rustic but cozy, the sort of description that usually meant drafty and outdated. I didn't mind. Christmas was only 3 days away. I figured I'd spend it quietly, maybe visit the old church she used to describe, and head back before the weather got bad. But the weather got bad faster than I expected. By the time I reached the cabin, snow had piled high on the roof and wind rattled every loose plank. Inside, the lights flickered once before holding steady. Everything smelled faintly of pine and something older, like old wood that had soaked up too many winters. I dropped my bags, turned up the heat, and wandered around. The place was small, 1 bedroom, a bathroom the size of a closet, and a front room with a sagging couch facing a stone fireplace. Above the fireplace hung a framed photograph of the cabin decades earlier. What struck me wasn't the cabin, it was the figure standing beside it. A tall man in an old-fashioned winter coat, head slightly tilted, his face blurred from the camera's age. Someone had tried to scratch the face clean off the glass. Thin white scars marked where fingernails or a knife had gouged at it. I found that strange. Stranger still was the feeling that washed over me the moment I looked at the photo, a kind of cold that went deeper than skin. The first night passed quietly. I unpacked, made instant soup, and tried to get some sleep. But around 2 a.m. something woke me. A scraping sound. Slow, steady, like someone dragging a branch or shovel through thick snow. I held my breath and listened. The scraping stopped, then came a crunch, footsteps, close to the porch. I sat up, heart pounding. There was no nearby cabin, no neighbors. Whoever was outside had no reason to be there. When I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the blinds, nobody was on the porch. Only a single set of footprints led from the tree line to the cabin steps, then stopped. No return prints. I barely slept after that. The next morning, determined not to jump at shadows, I went into town. Crestwood looked just as my mother had described. A long main street with a diner, a hardware store, and a church whose steeple rose above everything else. Christmas decorations hung everywhere, garland, old-style bulbs, faded ribbons that probably hadn't been replaced in decades. But something about the town felt off. People stared too long. Conversations stopped when I passed. I stopped at the diner for coffee and warmth. The waitress, an older woman with sharp eyes, set a mug in front of me and said, "You're not from around here." I nodded. "Just renting a cabin outside town." She stiffened. "Which one?" "The old Maxwell place," I said, remembering the name from the listing. Her face drained of color. "Shouldn't be renting that out anymore." "Why's that?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she called to someone in the kitchen, her voice shaking slightly. A man, maybe the owner, came out, wiped his hands on a towel, and glanced at me with the same uneasy look. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "that property's been empty for years. Nobody's supposed to go up there. You should leave before nightfall." I tried to laugh it off. "Look, if it's about permits or something." "It's not," he interrupted sharply. Then softer, "I'm sorry, just Christmas brings out the worst of it." "The worst of what?" The waitress placed a hand on his arm, and he didn't say another word. When I left, the church bells were ringing noon. The sound was thin, almost metallic, carried strangely by the wind. Back at the cabin, the footprints from the night before were still there, now partially filled with fresh snow. But something new had appeared on the porch. A long strip of old leather, cracked and stiff like it had been out in the cold for years. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. That night, the scraping sound returned, louder this time, circling the cabin. I turned off the lights and crouched near the window. A shadow moved between the trees. Tall. Too tall. I couldn't make out its face, or if it even had one, but the shape was unmistakably human. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing, as if watching. I let the blinds fall and backed away. Minutes later, something tapped the window glass. Not once. Over and over. Soft. Rhythmic. I sat frozen on the floor, knees pulled tight to my chest, listening to that slow, deliberate tapping until it finally stopped near dawn. I packed my bags the moment it got light. I was ready to leave, storm or not, but when I went outside, I saw the car, or what was left of it. Long gouges, deep, deliberate, ran across the doors and hood. All four tires were slashed. Snow had been packed tightly into the grill like someone had shoved handful after handful into it. In the middle of the windshield was another strip of old leather. I called the rental agency. No answer. I called local numbers I found online. No service. Not even emergency calls would go through. The storm had cut off the lines. I wasn't going anywhere. By evening, the wind screamed so loudly that the cabin seemed to tremble under its weight. Snow piled high against the door, and the dark came down like a curtain. Then came the knock. Soft at first, then harder, then pounding. I backed away from the door, heart hammering so loud I felt it in my teeth. The pounding stopped abruptly, followed by the long, slow creak of the porch boards bending under weight. Footsteps moved along the outside wall, then stopped right beside the window. The tapping returned, but this time I heard breathing behind it. Low, ragged, wet. I covered my ears, but I could still hear it somehow, like it was inside my head. When it finally went silent, hours must have passed. I stayed on the floor until dawn's faint light crept through the blinds. The window pane was cracked. Across it were smeared streaks of brownish red, too dark to be blood, too thick to be dirt. I didn't want to know. The storm had calmed, but my car was buried and destroyed. I decided to walk to town. It was only 5 miles, hard but doable. I grabbed my coat and opened the door, only to freeze. Someone had carved something into the snow on the top step. Letters made with long, dragging strokes. At first, I didn't recognize the word. Then I did. Stay. I stumbled back inside and slammed the door. My breath came fast and uneven. I didn't know what else to do but wait, and pray daylight would help. Around noon, I heard bells, the same church bells from town, but now they were close, too close. They rang slowly, almost mournfully, and beneath their tolling, I heard something else. Footsteps crunching in the snow, dozens of them. I looked out the window and felt my stomach drop. Figures stood at the tree line. Not one, many. Tall, silent, motionless. Each wore long coats or shapes that looked like coats, dark and tattered. Some wore what resembled old leather straps hanging from their shoulders. Their faces were wrong, blurred somehow like the man in the photograph above the fireplace. One stepped forward, then another. Then all of them, moving in slow, staggering unison toward the cabin. I backed away as they approached, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. I don't remember grabbing the fireplace poker, but it was suddenly in my hand. The figures reached the porch. Boards creaked under their combined weight. Then silence. A soft, deliberate knock. 3 times. I didn't move. The doorknob began to turn. I screamed and wedged a chair under the handle. The door jerked violently against it, wood cracking, hinges crying out. Then the church bells stopped. Everything went still. After minutes, maybe an hour, I finally dared to look out the window. They were gone. Only deep footprints remained, circling the cabin over and over until they vanished back into the woods. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Finally, on Christmas morning, a plow truck came up the road. A sheriff and 2 deputies knocked on the door, asking if I was the one renting the Maxwell place. They towed my car, helped me get my things, and drove me into town. I could barely speak. At the station, I asked the sheriff about the footprints, the tapping, the storm. He looked at me for a long time before saying quietly, "Nobody should be out at that cabin after December 15th. Not since the Maxwell family disappeared in '68. Every Christmas since, people hear things, see things. Some folks think they're still out there, trying to come home." I asked him who they were. He hesitated. "We don't know anymore. They don't look like how they used to. Whatever's left of them, it isn't right." I left Crestwood the next morning with the first clear stretch of highway. I didn't look back. I don't think I could have. But sometimes, on winter nights when the wind hits the eaves just right, I hear it again. That slow, steady tapping, like someone patiently waiting for me to open the door. Story the end. Snow had already begun to fall that Christmas Eve when I pulled off the highway and onto the narrow road that led to my uncle's old cabin. The storm was blowing in faster than the forecast predicted, and by late afternoon the sky had turned the flat, heavy gray that meant trouble. I'd promised my cousin Luke I'd spend Christmas with him that year, our first holiday without his dad, my Uncle Raymond, who'd passed just 3 months earlier. I'd kept saying I'd visit when Uncle Ray was alive, and after the funeral, guilt had made the promise too heavy to break. The forest swallowed the last bit of light as I drove deeper in. Snow glazed the evergreens lining the road, and the wind bent their tops like they were bowing. The cabin came into view. The same one Uncle Ray and my dad used to bring us to as kids. Back then it felt cozy, magical even. But after years of disrepair and distance, the place had the sag of something abandoned. The porch light flickered dimly, like it was struggling to stay awake. Luke stepped onto the porch just as I parked. He looked thinner than I remembered, his eyes hollow, the kind of emptiness grief carves out when no one's looking. "You made it," he said, hugging me quickly. "Storm's supposed to get worse tonight. You probably got the last safe drive in." He wasn't wrong. The snow fell so thick it seemed to erase the air itself. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and stale wood smoke. A small tree sat in the corner, decorated with a mix of old family ornaments and new ones I didn't recognize. A framed picture of Uncle Ray hung over the fireplace, one I'd never seen before. He stood stiffly in the photo, as if caught off guard, his expression almost tense. Something about the eyes didn't look quite right. "Mom sent me some of Dad's old stuff," Luke explained, noticing my stare. "She found that picture in a box." We settled in for the night, the storm rattling the shutters, the fire crackling, the heater clanking slightly with each cycle. Despite the weather, it felt good to be there, good to be doing something that resembled a family Christmas. Around midnight, the power flickered. "Old wiring," Luke muttered. "It happens." We played cards and talked about childhood Christmases, about the dumb games Uncle Ray would make us play. Every memory felt heavy with the reminder that he wasn't there to make new ones. By 1 a.m, I was exhausted. Luke stayed by the fire, drinking some kind of craft whiskey he'd picked up, and I headed to the guest room, the one I'd stayed in as a kid. The wallpaper had peeled in the corners, and the bed frame creaked when I sat down. The window overlooked the backyard. The shed Uncle Ray kept locked, the same one he always said held tools and junk. We'd never been allowed in, no matter how much we begged. The storm outside intensified, snow blowing sideways, the wind howling sharp and angry. Just as I crawled into bed, the lights went out completely. Silence dropped over the cabin like a curtain, except for the storm shaking the walls. I closed my eyes, ready to drift off, when I heard footsteps. Not Luke's. These were heavier, slow, deliberate. They crossed the hall outside my room, then stopped right at my door. I froze. My breath hitched. "Luke?" I called softly. No answer. The handle didn't turn. Nothing moved. After a few seconds, I convinced myself that the old cabin was settling under the force of the storm. I rolled over, trying to calm myself. Then I heard it. A knock on the window. 3 taps. I sat up instantly. My heart thudded so hard I felt it in my throat. The window was covered in frost. I couldn't see out. I pulled the curtain aside with shaking fingers. Nothing. just the snow swirling under the porch light's faint glow. I backed away from the glass, embarrassed at how rattled I was, telling myself it was a branch or ice shifting. But there were no trees near that window. I lay back down, listening to the wind for what felt like an hour before I finally drifted off. When I woke, the room was freezing. Dawn hadn't even broken yet. The fire must have died, and without heat, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped drastically. I slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway. The house was unnervingly quiet. "Luke?" I called. No response. I found him asleep in the armchair by the fireplace, an empty glass on the table beside him. The fire was long gone, the logs cold. I nudged him awake. He blinked, groggy. "What time is it?" "A little after 7, I said. "Power's still out?" He nodded and wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. "Storm must have knocked out the lines. We'll have to wait it out." I didn't want to bring up the footsteps or the knocking. It seemed childish in daylight, but something still clung to me. A lingering heaviness that felt almost physical. We decided to shovel a path to the woodpile. The shed sat at the far end of the yard, half buried in snow. I couldn't help but glance at it while we worked. The padlock still on the door, the wood siding weathered and dark. "You ever go in there?" I asked. Luke didn't look up. "No. Dad kept it locked. Mom said it was just tools, nothing interesting." The storm had stopped, but the sky stayed low and gray. After hauling enough wood inside for 2 days, we warmed up by the newly lit fire. I made coffee on the gas stovetop, and for a few hours the cabin felt like normal, 2 cousins trying to piece together a holiday. But around noon, things shifted again. I was in the bathroom washing my hands when I heard Luke shout from the living room. "Hey, how'd you get in here?" I rushed out. He stood by the back door, staring at muddy boot prints on the floor, boot prints leading from the door to the hallway. The door itself was closed. "Did you go out?" he asked me, confused. "No," I said. "I haven't been outside since this morning." His face went pale. The prints were large, much larger than either of our boot sizes, the sole pattern unfamiliar. "Maybe they're old," I suggested weakly, but even as I said it, I knew they weren't. The mud was fresh, wet, and the snow outside hadn't melted enough to expose mud. Luke knelt beside one of the prints. "These aren't mine." A cold shiver ran through me. We followed the trail down the hall. The prints stopped right outside my bedroom door, right where I'd heard the footsteps the night before. I felt nauseous. The door was closed. Neither of us had been inside since morning. Luke pushed it open slowly. The bed covers were pulled back, and on the pillow lay a small, rusted metal object. I stepped closer, dread thick in my throat. It was a key. Luke stared at it. "I've never seen that before." We exchanged a look, both knowing exactly what we were thinking. The shed. We didn't want to go out there, not really, but neither of us could shake the feeling that if someone had been in the cabin, we had to know who, or how, or why. We bundled up, grabbed a flashlight, and pushed through the snow toward the shed. The closer we got, the more the uneasy feeling in my gut tightened, like something inside me wanted to turn back. The padlock was old, rusted. Luke inserted the key with trembling hands. It clicked open. The door groaned as we pulled it open. Inside was pitch dark, colder than the air outside. The smell hit first, a damp metallic odor mixed with something sour. We turned on the flashlight. Inside, the shed wasn't full of tools. It was full of photographs, hundreds of them, thousands maybe. Tacked onto the walls, stacked in boxes, scattered across the floor. Most were of forests, cabins, animals, normal outdoor stuff. But some were of people, strangers, families, couples, all taken through windows. Some at night, some while they slept. My stomach twisted when I saw a picture near the back wall, one that looked disturbingly familiar. I stepped closer. It was my family's house. The photo was taken from the tree line behind our backyard. The sliding glass door was illuminated as if caught by a camera flash. "Jesus," I whispered, "what the hell was your dad doing?" Luke shook his head. His face had gone white. No, Dad wasn't like this. He couldn't, but the proof was everywhere. Then I heard it. Snow crunching outside the shed. Slow footsteps. They stopped right outside the door. Luke killed the flashlight instinctively, plunging us into darkness. We held our breath. The shed door creaked, not opening, just shifting as if someone placed their hand against it. Then a second sound. Breathing, not the wind, not an animal, a person, slow, heavy, deliberate, the same rhythm as the footsteps from the night before. Luke clutched my arm. I felt him trembling. The handle turned slightly. I almost passed out from fear. Then a loud crack echoed from the woods, a tree branch breaking. The breathing stopped. The footsteps moved away, slow but steady, crunching deeper into the snow until they faded entirely. We didn't move for nearly a minute. When we finally did, we ran from the shed, slamming the door behind us and sprinting back to the cabin. Once inside, we locked every door, every window, and barricaded the front entrance with a dresser. Luke paced, shaking. Dad wasn't like this, he kept repeating, like saying it enough times would make it true. But the pictures, they told a story neither of us wanted to believe. That night, neither of us slept. The storm picked up again, wind battering the cabin, snow hitting the windows in sheets. Every sound made my pulse jump. Around 3 a.m, the power flickered back on for a split second. Just long enough for every light in the cabin to flash to life, including the porch light. And in that brief moment of illumination, something moved past the living room window. A large silhouette. Human. We ducked behind the couch as the shape paused outside. The porch boards creaked under its weight. Then 3 taps on the window. The same rhythm as before. I clamped a hand over my mouth, terrified to breathe. The tapping came again, slower this time, almost, patient. Luke's eyes filled with tears. The shadow lingered a moment longer, then drifted away, disappearing into the storm. We waited until sunrise before moving. By then, the storm had calmed, and the world outside was silent. We gathered our things, dumped the key back on the floor, and drove away without looking back. Neither of us said a word during the drive. Police later said the shed contained eccentric hobby material and nothing criminal. They blamed the footprints on a lost hiker. But the prints were too large, the breathing too close, the tapping too intentional, and the photographs, especially the newest ones, the ones they didn't let us take home, the ones taken inside the cabin, of Luke sleeping by the fire, of me in the guest room. Both pictures time-stamped, 1 hour before I arrived. I haven't been back to that cabin since. Luke moved out of state the following spring, trying to outrun the nightmare that his father apparently lived in secret. Every Christmas Eve, he texts me the same message. Keep your windows locked tonight. I always do. Because sometimes late at night, when the wind is low and the snow is soft, I swear I hear it again. 3 slow taps at the glass. Story the end. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Millfield, Vermont, a place that prided itself on twinkling lights and picturesque snow-covered streets. The Thompson family had just finished decorating their modest 2-story home on Pine Street. Their living room glowed warmly, the tree adorned with handmade ornaments, strands of white lights, and a star that had been passed down for 3 generations. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows as snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the neighborhood in a pristine, silent white. Ben Thompson, a 37-year-old firefighter, had just finished hanging the last stocking on the mantle. His wife, Laura, was in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on Christmas dinner, while their kids, Ted's 10-year-old Ellie and 7-year-old Sam, were sprawled on the floor beneath the tree, wrapping the last few gifts. There was a sense of calm, the kind of cozy peace that comes only when the work is done and everyone is waiting for magic. Ben poured himself a cup of coffee, taking in the scene. "Everything looks perfect," he said, a smile spreading across his tired face. Ellie beamed, showing off the star she had carefully placed atop the gingerbread house they had made earlier. Outside, the wind gusted harder, causing the old pine trees lining the street to groan and sway. It was winter in its most classic form, the kind that made you grateful for warmth indoors. Around 8 p.m., Ben went to check the locks on the doors and windows. The Thompson house sat at the end of Pine Street, the last in a row of homes that had seen better days. Across the street, the old Miller place had been abandoned for years, a hulking structure of peeling paint and broken windows. Kids in town whispered about it being haunted, but adults dismissed the stories as folklore. Still, there was something unsettling about the house that Ben had never liked. On this particular night, in the flickering glow of the street lamp, he noticed a shadow moving past the broken curtains of the Miller house's second-floor window. He squinted, but whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Shaking his head, he muttered, "Just my imagination," and went back inside. By 9 p.m., the wind had grown into a near blizzard. The power flickered twice, but held steady. The family gathered around the living room to open the first round of presents. Ellie's excitement was infectious. Sam, though younger, followed her lead, tearing through wrapping paper with abandon. Laura leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine and watching her family with contentment. Ben noticed, though, that the warmth and laughter were punctuated by an underlying tension he couldn't place. The air felt heavier than usual, almost as if the storm outside was pressing against the walls of their home, and with it came a subtle, creeping unease. When it was time to eat, the family sat down to a traditional Christmas dinner. Turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, everything was perfect. But as Ben carved the turkey, he noticed something strange. The lights above the table flickered violently. For a moment, the room plunged into darkness, then returned to normal. Electrical issues, Ben said aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. Laura frowned but said nothing. Ellie whispered that she had heard someone outside, laughing. Sam said he saw a man in a dark coat standing by the pine tree out back. Ben laughed it off and went to check the perimeter. There was no one there, only the snow, drifting silently. After dinner, the family settled back into the living room. Ellie wanted to watch a Christmas movie, while Sam begged to tell ghost stories instead. Ben, a practical man, agreed to one story, then planned to switch back to cheerful fare. That's when they heard it. The first knock at the door. It was soft, deliberate. One knock, then another. 1. Pause. 3. The pattern was off. Ben froze, a chill creeping down his spine. He called out, "Who's there?" Silence. Just the wind. The knocks resumed, faster this time, echoing through the house like someone was trying to communicate in Morse code. Laura clutched the kids. Ben grabbed his flashlight and his baseball bat, approaching the door cautiously. Through the peephole, he saw nothing. No silhouette, no footprints in the snow leading up to the door, just empty, white silence. Relieved, he returned to the family, trying to calm them. "Probably a branch," he said, forcing a smile. But deep down he knew it wasn't. Branches didn't knock in patterns, and branches didn't come back again and again. They settled in, trying to ignore the growing tension, but the sound didn't stop. Knocks, then scratching. Something or someone was outside, circling the house. By 11 p.m., the storm outside had grown violent. The wind slammed against the house with a force that shook the walls. Ben decided to call the police, thinking perhaps someone had gotten lost in the storm and was seeking shelter. But when he picked up the phone, the line was dead. Every line, not even a dial tone. That's when the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Only the flickering of the Christmas tree lights remained, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Then came the whispering. Ellie's eyes widened. "Mom, Dad, someone's outside," she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispers were faint, almost indistinguishable at first. Then they became clearer, forming words. Come out, we're waiting, we know you're in there." The family huddled together in the living room, fear rooting them to the spot. Ben moved to the window, shining the flashlight out into the storm. What he saw made his blood run cold. Footprints in the snow. Not just one set, but dozens encircling the house. And in the distance, through the blizzard, figures moving, tall, thin silhouettes, impossibly dark against the white snow. No faces, just black shapes. They didn't run. They didn't hurry. They just moved slowly, methodically, like predators waiting for the right moment. Ben knew they couldn't leave. Not through the storm, not into the unknown outside. He barricaded the doors with chairs, stacked furniture against the windows, anything to slow them down. The family huddled together in the living room, shivering in more than just cold. Each minute stretched into eternity. The wind howled, the house groaned, and the knocks, scratching, and whispering continued without pause. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Morning came, but the storm hadn't lifted. And then, as if the night had finally claimed its final victim, the family realized something horrifying. The figures were inside. Not just around the house, but inside. The living room was empty, except for the family. Shadows flickered across the walls, shadows that didn't belong to anyone there. Objects moved slightly when no one touched them. The whispering was louder now, more insistent, circling them from every direction. Ben tried to confront them, demanding they leave, but his voice was swallowed by the storm, the shadows and the whispers. The figures pressed closer, and the temperature dropped. Breath crystallized in the air. Ellie clutched her mother, and Sam cried, "Why won't they leave?" But Ben had no answer, only terror. Only the undeniable truth that whatever had found them in the night was not human, and it was not bound by the laws of the living. By mid-morning, the storm abated slightly, enough that neighbors began to notice the Thompson house. They called the police, concerned about the lack of lights, the lack of movement, the strange sounds that had emanated from the house throughout the night. When authorities arrived, they found the home in disarray. Furniture toppled, the tree uprooted from its stand, ornaments shattered, the family gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow leading away. Nothing but an overwhelming sense of dread that lingered in the air. The Thompsons were never found. Weeks later, the house was boarded up, left to rot. People reported strange sightings, figures moving past the windows, lights flickering on their own, whispering on the wind. And every Christmas, snow would fall on Pine Street. But the Thompson house would remain untouched, pristine, as if frozen in time, waiting for the next family to discover that some holidays are better left uncelebrated. Story the end. It was the night before Christmas in Cedar Hollow, a small town in rural Ohio where the snow always came heavy and early. Street lights glimmered against thick layers of frost, and the townsfolk were busy preparing for the holiday. Most houses were cheerful, lights twinkling in the windows, wreaths hung on doors, and smoke curling from chimneys. But at the edge of town, the old Whitman house sat silent. It had been abandoned for years, a sagging Victorian with boarded windows, as well as peeling paint, and rumors that kept children away. Every year, the locals whispered about it during the holidays, insisting the house was haunted, but no one had lived there in decades. On Christmas Eve, a family named the Carters moved into the Whitman house. They weren't superstitious, they were practical, excited to start fresh after a messy year. Tom Carter, his wife Laura, and their two children, Lily, 7, and Jacob, 4, were unpacking boxes when the sun began to set. The house was cold, the heating barely working, but Laura reassured everyone that a fire in the old stone fireplace would warm them soon. The first odd thing happened around dinner time. Tom went to the kitchen to get plates and noticed that some of the cabinets were already slightly ajar, though they'd been locked when he checked earlier. Thinking it was just the previous owner's careless packing, he closed them and didn't mention it. But when he returned, the cabinets were open again. He tried to ignore it. After dinner, they decided to start decorating. Lily was thrilled to unpack ornaments she had made in preschool, and Jacob insisted on placing the little nativity scene by the window. As they hung lights, Laura noticed something odd outside. Through the frost-covered window, she saw a faint shadow standing at the edge of the yard. She blinked, and it was gone. When she mentioned it, Tom brushed it off, saying the shadows from the trees looked strange in the snow and dim light. The family tried to settle for the night. Tom set the fire roaring, and Laura read a story to Lily and Jacob before tucking them in. But just after midnight, the children woke screaming. Laura ran upstairs to find both of them pointing to the corner of the room, trembling. "There's a man," Lily cried. "He's tall and he's watching." Laura's heart raced. There was no one there, but the feeling of being watched was real. She comforted the kids, insisting it was a dream, though even she felt a shiver crawling down her spine. Tom came upstairs, and together they checked every corner, every closet. The house was empty. That night, strange noises began. Footsteps on the stairs, creaking floorboards in rooms no one was in, soft whispers in the hallways. Tom, thinking it was the house settling, tried to sleep, but every sound seemed deliberate, almost like someone or something was moving with purpose. By 3 a.m., the whispers had turned into low murmurs, unintelligible but filled with malice. The children refused to sleep in their rooms, insisting on sleeping with their parents. Around 4 a.m., the fire suddenly went out, plunging the living room into darkness. Tom lit a flashlight and went to relight it, but when he turned back, the Christmas tree was shaking violently. Ornaments shattered, and the star at the top fell to the ground. The lights on the tree blinked erratically, as if responding to a presence in the room. Laura grabbed the children, and the family huddled together. "We need to get out," she whispered. Tom nodded, grabbing his coat. As they approached the front door, it slammed shut in front of them. Not just a gust of wind, the kind of slam that made the windows rattle violently. He tried to open it, locked. The windows were the same. Then came the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate, circling the house from the outside. Tom peered out a window and saw nothing, but the sound continued. A faint jingling began, like sleigh bells, though distorted, dragging, not the cheerful music of Christmas. It moved around the house, stopping at times, then starting again, as if stalking them. At one point, Jacob began crying. "He's coming inside," he screamed. The family turned toward the living room, and Laura saw it. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the shadows. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, and its hands were long and pale. It didn't walk, it glided across the floor, leaving faint scratches on the hardwood. Tom grabbed a fireplace poker, ready to defend his family. "Who are you?" he shouted. The figure didn't respond, but tilted its head, slowly, unnaturally. The children clung to Laura, sobbing. Then a whisper filled the room, louder than before. Not outside the house, inside, around them. All gifts will be claimed, all secrets revealed. The words repeated over and over, chilling and hollow. Tom tried to rationalize. "It's a prank! Someone is in the house!" He ran toward the figure swinging the poker. His hand passed through it like mist. The figure laughed, a sound that wasn't human, a high-pitched, echoing noise that made the blood in his veins turn cold. Suddenly, the living room lights exploded, showering sparks everywhere. Smoke filled the air, and the Christmas tree toppled completely, catching the carpet on fire. Laura screamed as she pulled the kids away, but when she looked up, the figure had vanished. They scrambled to the kitchen, grabbing a fire extinguisher, dousing the flames, but the house didn't feel safe. Every shadow seemed alive, every reflection in the window distorted. The whispers continued, now chanting, repeating those same chilling words. In desperation, Tom remembered the old journal he had found in the attic earlier that week, belonging to the Whitmans. Flipping through it, he found entries detailing strange occurrences on Christmas Eve over the decades. Families hearing footsteps, seeing shadows, items moving, and strange figures demanding truth. One entry stood out. "The watcher comes for those who bring secrets into the house. The house will test them. The innocent may survive, the guilty will not." The words hit him like a punch. The house hadn't been empty for decades. Something had waited for someone to move in. Something that thrived on fear, on secrets, on lies. And now it had them. Desperate, Tom began talking aloud, confessing small lies, minor mistakes, hoping it would appease whatever haunted them. We weren't honest about some things," he said. "We've made mistakes, we've hidden things. Please, leave us be." The whispers paused, the silence deafening. Then slowly, the house seemed to settle. The lights stabilized, the shadows receded, and the temperature rose slightly. The front door, locked before, now swung open. The family, trembling, gathered their things and left, driving away into the snowy night. They stayed with relatives in town for the rest of Christmas, but when they returned days later to check the house, it was quiet. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing. Only the lingering smell of burnt pine and the faint echo of distant jingling bells. Over the years, the Carters never spent Christmas in that house again. Friends asked why they refused to decorate the Whitman home. Tom and Laura never told anyone the full story, only hinting that the house was unusual. But the children remembered. Lily, now an adult, still wakes up on Christmas Eve with the sense of being watched, a lingering shadow in the corner of her room. Jacob, older and married, never places gifts under the tree without checking first for something else. The Whitman house still stands at the edge of Cedar Hollow. On quiet winter nights, the locals swear they can hear the faint jingling of bells, the whisper of voices repeating, "All gifts will be claimed, all secrets revealed." And sometimes, just sometimes, a faint light can be seen flickering in the windows, though no one has lived there in years. Christmas in Cedar Hollow is never the same for anyone who knows the story. Families speak in hushed tones about the Whitman house, children are warned not to venture near it, and everyone locks their doors extra tight on Christmas Eve. Some say the watcher waits for the next family to move in, hungry for secrets, for fear, for whatever darkness can be drawn from human hearts. The Carters, like many who've crossed paths with the Whitman house, never fully recovered. Their Christmases were forever haunted by shadows and whispers, by the feeling that someone or something was always watching, just beyond the edge of vision, ready to claim what was theirs. And every year, when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through Cedar Hollow, the jingling starts again, a chilling reminder that some gifts are never meant to be opened. Story the end. The snow fell heavily that Christmas Eve in the small town of Millstone, Pennsylvania, blanketing the streets and houses in a thick, silent layer of white. The town had always been the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, where families baked cookies together, and the smell of pine from the Christmas trees filled living rooms. But that year, something felt off, even to the most optimistic residents. It started with the Thompson family. They had lived in the same house on Willow Street for decades, a quaint home with white shutters and a chimney that always puffed smoke during winter. Mary Thompson, a mother of 3, had been busy decorating their living room with twinkling lights and ornaments collected over years. Her husband, Robert, had gone out earlier in the day to pick up the last-minute gifts and promised to be home by evening. Their children, Ethan, 12, and Lily, 7, were bouncing with excitement as they hung stockings by the fireplace. As the evening set in, a strange wind began to blow outside, rattling the windows. Mary dismissed it as a winter storm and went about her chores, but the children noticed it too. Ethan, with his curiosity piqued, looked out the window and saw what appeared to be a figure standing at the edge of the yard. He blinked, but when he rubbed his eyes, the figure remained. A tall silhouette, unmoving, watching them. "Mom, there's someone outside," Ethan called, his voice trembling. Mary, trying to reassure him, peered out the window but saw nothing except the swirling snow. "It's probably just a shadow," she said, though she couldn't shake the unease creeping up her spine. By the time Robert returned home, the wind had grown stronger, howling through the streets and creating eerie whistling sounds around the house. He carried the gifts inside, laughing off the storm's intensity. But as he set the packages down, the children noticed something strange. The tree lights flickered in a pattern, almost like a heartbeat, and a chill ran down their spines. That night, as the family sat down to watch a Christmas movie, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the fireplace, which seemed to burn colder than usual. Ethan swore he saw the tall silhouette from before move across the room, disappearing behind the curtains. "Probably just your imagination," Robert said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mary tried to call their neighbors, but the phone line was dead. Even their cell phones had no signal. The storm outside was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Blinding snow, gusts of wind, and a quiet that felt too heavy, oppressive. Around midnight, the children woke to strange noises. Soft whispers seemed to come from the hallways, and the scent of something rotting filled the air. Ethan peeked out of his room and saw the silhouette again, closer this time, standing in the doorway to the living room. Its form was tall, almost impossibly thin, with long, spindly arms that moved unnaturally. Its face was obscured by a dark hood, but something about its presence felt malicious, like it was feeding on their fear. Mary and Robert woke to the screams of the children. By the time they reached the hallway, the figure had vanished, leaving behind icy footprints that crunched unnaturally over the carpet. The family huddled together in the living room, trying to rationalize what was happening. They had always believed in safety in their small, close-knit town, but now everything felt fragile, like the storm outside had brought something ancient and evil with it. The next morning, the snowstorm had passed, leaving a serene, white world outside. But the tranquility was deceptive. The Thompsons' neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, had disappeared from her home on the corner of the street. Her front door was wide open, and inside, her house looked untouched, except for the fireplace, which was eerily cold, the ashes black and undisturbed. No one in town could explain where she had gone. As days passed, reports of disappearances and strange sightings grew. People spoke of dark figures lurking near homes, of shadows that didn't match their surroundings, of whispers in the wind that seemed to call names. The local authorities were baffled, finding no evidence of intruders, no signs of struggle, only the terrified faces of those who had seen the figures. Back in the Thompson household, the family's sense of safety unraveled completely. Lights flickered, shadows danced in corners, and the fireplace seemed to breathe cold air that left frost on the windowsills. One night, Robert awoke to the sound of laughter. Soft, childlike, but distorted and chilling. He followed it to the basement door, where the handle rattled violently. Ethan, unable to sleep, had ventured into the living room and was staring at the tree. The ornaments shimmered in the firelight, but one in particular caught his eye, a small figurine of a man in a hood, standing unnaturally straight. As he watched, the figurine seemed to shift, its head turning slowly to look at him. He stumbled back, screaming, and the figurine shattered into dust that smelled of iron and smoke. The family tried to leave, to seek help, but every exit from Millstone seemed blocked. Roads twisted impossibly, the town stretching and shrinking like a living maze. Attempts to drive away led them back to Willow Street, back to the Thompson house, as if the town itself had trapped them inside a nightmare. By Christmas morning, the storm had lifted entirely, revealing the pristine beauty of snow-covered streets and rooftops. But inside the Thompson house, the air was heavy, suffocating. Shadows clung to the walls, whispering and shifting. Mary found her children standing silently in front of the tree, their eyes vacant, staring at the corner of the room where the figure had first appeared. It wasn't long before the family realized the horrifying truth. The entity didn't just appear in Millstone. It was drawn to the holiday, feeding on the fear and hope that Christmas embodied. It thrived on family gatherings, on warmth and joy, twisting them into terror. Attempts to escape were futile. Each time the family thought they had reached safety, the town bent back upon itself. Neighbors were gone, houses abandoned, and the streets whispered with the wind, carrying voices that mimicked the lost and the dead. Days stretched into weeks without the normal passage of time, snow falling eternally, and the figure always watching, always close, yet never fully visible. The Thompsons clung to each other, praying, hiding, and trying to hold on to sanity. But Christmas, the one time of year that was supposed to bring joy, became an endless cycle of fear. The tree lights would flicker at night, ornaments would move on their own, and the fireplace would exhale icy breaths into the room. Ethan and Lily began speaking to someone, or something, no one else could see. Then, on Christmas Eve of the following year, another family in Millstone reported strange occurrences. Dark silhouettes at the edge of their property, whispers in the wind, and cold air that burned the skin. The Thompsons were never seen again, and their house remained locked, the windows frosted over from the eternal winter. Townsfolk avoided Willow Street, whispering of a curse that haunted Millstone every year, of shadows that preyed on hope and fear alike. Millstone slowly returned to a semblance of normal life, but the story of the Thompson family became legend. Parents warned children not to wander alone at night, especially during Christmas. The town's Christmas cheer carried a strange edge, an undercurrent of fear that no one could shake. Every year, as the snow began to fall, residents would glance nervously at the streets, half expecting to see a figure at the edge of their yard, tall, thin, and hooded, waiting for the holiday to bring them inside its icy grip. Some say that if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers carried by the wind, echoing through the streets of Millstone, calling names that no one dares answer. Families vanish, time stretches, and the town bends around those who dare to flee. Christmas, for Millstone, is no longer a time of joy. It is a time of watching, waiting, and surviving the horror that came with the snow. Even now, decades later, the Thompson house stands frozen in time, its windows dark, the wreath on the door covered in frost, and the shadows that linger inside never move. Those brave or foolish enough to approach say they feel a presence, an unseen gaze that follows them, that knows them, that hungers. And every Christmas, the town collectively holds its breath, dreading the return of the wind, the cold, and the figure that waits patiently for the warmth of human hope to turn it into terror once again. Story the end.